And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. Oh, what a fantastic crowd we have out there in the Ideas Room already. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, I am the eye in the sky looking at you. Mm-hmm. I can read your mind. Mm-hmm. And my day started off in total amusement as they rolled out the Joe Rogan interview with Elon Musk. And he said, don't worry about it. There's no UFOs. There's no UFOs. Oh, really, I would have known. They would have briefed me. I would have seen it. Huh. No. There are UFOs, and you, as a member of SpaceX, has the largest private collection of images and videos. So let's be honest there, Elon. Get real. But I didn't expect anything else, but it was quite amusing. We had a lot of amusing acting out on the stage of the world today, and one of the greatest, of course, was Trump with Zelensky. We're going to get into that in a minute. Tonight's very special episode. It's so great to have so many of you here with us. This is X-Series 190, and it is Steiner, Psychic Elementals, and the UFO File. You know, we came off this incredibly rich episode on the 8th Sphere last week in the Power Zone. And this whole thing about elementals and the interbetween and those realms, as it were, seems to be little understood, and it's certainly not part of the regular conversation when it comes to the occult, unfortunately, and anything esoteric. But those who know that it's a major part of the whole thing, and certainly a major tenet of the mystery schools. But what does that have to do with the UFO file? This becomes a very interesting question. We're going to get into that tonight in this very special episode. And in the second half of tonight's episode, we'll also be taking your questions, which Miss Olivia is putting together. And I want to remind you that tonight we're going to go about 2 hours and get deep into this. And remember that if you're new, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter. And if you want to check that door sound out, you're welcome to do so. And it's basically available. One of the things that happens there is to get around, you know, all of this very intense censorship that we've been seeing. The best way to get around it is to go and have that newsletter come directly to you, because sometimes, you know, on these social media platforms, they really lean back on the work that we do. And the best way to make sure you're in there is to be on that newsletter. And we're going to let you know about the exciting shows that we have coming up for you, including some great documentaries. Of course, JFK, The Final Speech is the most recent one, and our docuseries, Hacking Atlantis, which has to be seen to be believed. You know, it's funny, all the Epstein things that came up this week, and we're still waiting for those things. Of course, some of the major documents in relation to the Epstein case come out of the Maxwell case, because after all, they had put her in prison for trafficking, but they never released who she was trafficking to. Whereas on the Epstein side, we actually have quite a bit. So it's very interesting, dodgy stuff. There was a little bit of a fumble with the rollout there for Bondi and some of the things that were going on.
Just a little.
That's just not the way to do it. But, you know, like I've said, the Trump administration has 100 days to really present their thing, and giving them the, you know, opportunity to roll things out and try different things is okay by me. I do feel that, you know, the approach of just releasing this stuff in this era is probably the best way to go. And certainly not sectioning it off to certain influencers. That was maybe not the best on that, but they'll have more chances. And certainly with the JFK records, I want to bring this around. The JFK records are some of the most important records the government holds, and in relation to the deep state and in relation to the UFO file. So although there's a lot of other things about these other files, really the thrust of transparency starts there, because you're talking about records that have been sat on for 61 years regarding the removal of a president. So, you know, this is maybe where the rubber meets the road on that. And I think we're going to get into that tonight as well. So a very, very spacey, cosmic episode for you, going deep on the esoteric side tonight, and the mystery schools and their guidance very, very deep in this episode as well. And before I go any further, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Scarlet Fire says, what a time to be alive. On the evening of February 28th, 2025, all 7 of the other planets in the solar system will appear in the night sky at the same time, with Saturn, Mercury, Neptune, Venus, Uranus, Jupiter, and Mars lining up.
I have that I can jump over anything feeling. Yeah, this is very interesting, and you have to imagine how the ancients would have seen something like that. They would have known the significance of it, of course. And when we get around things also that pertain to meteors and the impacts, the different things that have happened over the years, we see the ancients were very plugged in to how these things impacted the Earth and the entire evolution of humanity. So there's signs and signals, as it were. But certainly if we were looking at this, say from a Mayan outpost circa 500 BC, it would have been a very different type of understanding. But we understand that this is certainly significant. And I think what's odd about that particular alignment that's coming up, not only is it an astrological wonder, but on the astronomy side, it may hearken to new pathways open, so like Earth changes and things of this nature. This is what I've learned from the work of Edgar Cayce, that the astronomical alignments correlate directly with the pole positions and the land masses of the Earth. And this has been kind of a gradual process of shifting. But there's a couple of things that I pulled out of the Cayce archive tonight that we're going to get into regarding land rising, which is something I've been trying to put on the map here for a while, and you're starting to hear people catch on to it as well. I did mention the Trump-Zelensky meeting at the White House. I want to tell you there's a couple of glorious things involved here. One, Elon Musk wasn't there. Let Trump be Trump and conduct business without Musk always over his shoulder. That's number one for the Trump administration. But two, this guy was coming off, Zelensky, like we owed him and all this stuff, when we've sent $350 billion over there and haven't got anything in return, except that much closer to World War III. And this is Biden's war and all the rest of it. All Trump is trying to do is withdraw from the war, and he needs Zelensky to agree to a ceasefire and all this kind of stuff. Instead, this guy who, is really a parasite when it comes to our foreign policy and, has outstayed his welcome dramatically and was installed in the first place. He went in there to give Trump a hard time, and Trump wasn't having any of it. And J.D. Vance jumped in there too. That's what you want to see, the Trump-Vance alliance move forward. You want to see Trump with him. It's a much better person to play off of. But, and Trump was basically like, hey, look, it's up to you. You can either agree to the ceasefire or go fight it on your own, but we're not going to do both, give you weapons for nothing. And he's absolutely right. And the United States' position is to try to find some type of ceasefire agreement with Russia and move towards peace in that region. It's the only thing to do. It was the neocon CIA aspect with the Biden administration that really wanted this war and pushed it throughout. So we're in a weird position there now, because withdrawing from it after the overinvestment brings us into a situation not unlike Vietnam, say around 1963. 64, just before it went into overdrive. So it's interesting because Putin, in his statements about this, said, there are very deep forces that are trying to prevent the United States and Russia from achieving any kind of agreement. And he's right. And those forces have been in place for many, many years, over 100 years. And there's something very, very strange about it. But when we look at the work of Edgar Cayce, the Sleeping Prophet, he did say that the hope of the world would come out of Russia in terms of spiritual thought. And part of the bombardment and the push through Ukraine to Russia is not only for the resources and all the things in that region, but also to get a handle on this thing before it comes into full bloom, whatever it is. That is the mystical track that's going to help us understand some of the geopolitical moves going on there in the background. I did mention that Musk was playing dumb and when he was on Joe Rogan, and Rogan said, what do you think that these Navy pilots are seeing, like, David Fravor and stuff? And Musk said, I hope we find something, but I have not seen anything. Yeah, sure. So Musk's compilation of photos and videos of UFOs in space, in inner space, low Earth orbit, etc., is the most extensive of any except for the United States government. So those were pretty flat out lies. And it's just interesting. If I were him, I'd avoid the subject rather than lie about it. One of the things that's interesting that is happening, however, is that Rogan is getting very wise to the counterintelligence push around the UFO file for the UFO threat narrative, and realizes, like a lot of people do now, and we were there first pointing it out, but a lot of people really are coming to this realization, and it's been a slow burn, but you can see that breaking point, that they realize that counterintelligence and intelligence officials, the deepest and darkest type of agents, have been infiltrating on the UFO side. They came through with the threat narrative, and we here, just us here, this lone outpost with the ideas from ricocheted that one off, and it went into so many other places, so that now there's a number of people calling out the UFO obsters. And remember, the UFO file is the real deal, but the CIA UFO file threat narrative is completely false and made up by them for an emergency power scenario. But it's interesting because Joe Rogan said, I've had these people on my show and I don't feel anything from them. I don't feel the truth of it or anything. And he says, clever agents go and whistleblowers tell some stories and talk about this and that. And he's starting to get it. So you see how this works? This is a glorious thing for us to watch. And I've pointed out before that some of the people have been placed intentionally for disinformation purposes. One of them, Peter Thiel has his own people out there doing this thing. And one of those guys that he put out there imitated this show heavily and without crediting any of the ideas. And it's very interesting because, and I've pointed this out, but one thing I want to say about it tonight that I think really captures this, which is this guy is so close with that false UFO threat narrative and all those people. And that's the Jesse Michaels show with Lou Elizondo and all of his friends there. Now, this joker who's done this and been financed by Peter Thiel to come into the UFO space and platform these people now claims, I'm being tracked by the UFO deep state. Oh, he's in fear. He's in fear because he's told too much truth. No, you're hanging out with the top CIA people and promoting their threat narrative. You're fine. And Peter Thiel is bankrolling it. So let's play it straight and let's not have those kinds of games going on. Let's get real and a little laying off of the drama and laying off the plagiarization and maybe just going back and doing your own work. Maybe going back to invest for Peter Thiel might suit you better. What's also interesting to me is that people like John Greenwald in the Black Vault, who's done some good work, and he's starting to get it, and he's seeing through that. And one of the things that came out this week that Greenwald is a stickler for, and I appreciate it, which is, you might remember this, a couple of years ago, there was this thing about a triangle UFO that came out of the water, and they said, oh, the Pentagon confirms this, and they had Elizondo everywhere talking about this. Well, and saying that he had seen it, and Elizondo, who's really the chief disinformation agent in all of this right now, but it's Chris Mellon, the DOD official who's behind him, pushing him out there to do this for years. One of the things that they're doing, and he is central now to this Steven Spielberg movie, as I put on the record, and now people are catching on to that, but I was lucky enough to have a source on that, and it's very interesting because it's just been confirmed now that Elizondo was in New Jersey, which is where Spielberg is filming the Disclosure movie, and they're coming out with that in June of 2026. And I'm telling you, Elizondo's in the heart of that production. So Hollywood is completely bought over and gone over the falls with the CIA disinformation trip. And, that's going to bounce back at them, and that's fine. Let them do the disinformation trip. On the grassroots side, on the real side of investigation, we're going to have people who understand and see through that. And then you'll have this other thing. That's the divide that you want. That's how you get a real UFO field. And then the CIA circus becomes more and more obvious when you have real researchers on the ground. And it's funny because tonight, in the middle of all this elemental type stuff, we're going to get into the work of John Mack, the professor over here at Harvard, who really just came in with a totally different dynamic around the UFO field and gave us so much to work with, even though he's been dead now for almost 2 decades due to a tragic accident in the UK. But I think it's very interesting because when this thing came out about Elizondo confirming this whole thing, now the guy, Jay Stratton from Radiance Technologies, who was heading up the UAP task force, says, we never got a look at it, which means Elizondo never saw it, which means that's yet another Elizondo lie in public. And Greenwald is happy to point that out, and he should, because Lou is lying Lou. And that's what you get when you have counterintelligence people. They're trained liars, and they come out in the public stage to lie to the public to create a UFO national emergency threat. And, we've really spent a lot of time taking the air out of that particular balloon. And I don't mean the Chinese balloon. One of the interesting things about all this also is that, in Elizondo's case, he's run around saying, I've got this picture of a mothership and I debriefed the pilots and all that. And it turned out that he was peddling this picture that was a chandelier. Now, he doesn't have to do that because he's had access to real stuff. But this shows the mentality and the level that he's on, that if these people can get away with showing just BS things and pretending they were in these positions, then they'll do it. But the forces behind them certainly come from deep, deep in that CIA disinformation program, and they're sort of dangling these guys in the front. And it's very interesting because, I showed that that Jesse Michaels guy wanted to promote himself and platform Elizondo in this way and then say, the deep state's after me. Well, Lou is a CIA agent. I mean, how close to the deep state? The definition of deep state is CIA, correct? How about, if that picture doesn't work for you, how about him with his boss, James Clapper, the disgraced former DNI? So, if you're going to do this stuff, one of the things that I say is that if you're doing counterintelligence and you're outed, you should probably go find another profession because it becomes very difficult. But also, if you're in the truth-telling business and you're not telling the truth, get out of the business. That's another way to look at it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 190. We haven't even got into the psychic elementals in the UFO file yet. But boy, this is going to be fantastic stuff, putting it on the record. And I also want to remind you that in the second half of the program, we will take your questions. You can ask those now. Miss Olivia is putting them together. And, UFO experiences, family experiences, things that you've heard in relation to this, that all plays into what we're talking about tonight. And I think we're going to do better generally in the UFO field if we go deeper into the abduction experience in relation to this, because one of the things that the intel groups and the media have tried to lock us into is this whole, hey, there's military tech coming at us. And they've tried to switch out from that now. I did a series of episodes. Everyone's familiar with Gigi Young's work, and she's done a series of episodes about the psychic aspect relating to the UFO file. And I think they're trying to, they're trying to bully in and imitate that with the whole psionics thing, which is, again, more play on words things. They're trying to bring in this aspect to pretend they're getting around the threat thing because the threat thing was getting them in hot water. So we have to kind of keep that in mind when we look at these people that, they're always coming up with these things. I think I told you before about my conversations with David Grush, the UFO whistleblower and former NGA NRO guy, a major over there. He told me that NHI was something that he came up with and Chris Mellon instantly adopted, the whole non-human intelligence thing. Now everyone uses it, and it's not really...
Wait, Grush said he came up with an NHI?
He did?
I had somebody who was a fan of the show and talking to me about NHI like 6 years ago.
Oh,
or something
interesting.
Like that. So that's a bull.
Well, I'll tell you what's interesting. What's funny is that, how you hear all these guys talk about ontological shock? Mm-hmm. You've heard this phrase about 1 million times. In the 1994 book Abduction, John Mack he has a chapter called Ontological Shock. Mm-hmm. So you can see, they love picking up on this stuff. But I believe that, whatever Grush would come up with that Mellon would exploit for sure. There's no question. But one of the things that I've mentioned before is that, we ought to sort of circumvent their talking points on this. So like things like UAP, which is a terrible definition, the remarketing of the UFO file for the intel people. I don't think speaking in their language is a good idea. And if you want to invent a new language around the thing, fine, but let it come from actual research and not from any counterintelligence program, And one of the things that I've come up with around the UFO file, which comes up tonight, is Apium. And I'm going to give you some real interesting examples of Apium in the John Mack stories, because they're quite fascinating indeed. Missing time, anyone? Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, X-190, Psychic Elementals in the UFO File. Remember now, if you're new here, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. It's a free newsletter, but it keeps us in touch and gets us around all the intense censorship that we're looking at. And one of the great things that you're going to see in there is this announcement of the new documentaries, which we've been shooting, and also some live events. So it's all there in the newsletter for you. Go to darkjournalist.com and sign up. Miss Olivia, what do you got?
I just want to say, Brian Whitaker says, "Rip Gene Hackman, best Lex Luthor ever."
Oh, he's a fantastic
and Royal
actor.
Tannenbaum.
Yeah,
but
he was also in The Invaders. If you go back and watch the 1960s series, he's one of the aliens in The Invaders. But he had incredible roles, and his death is very, very strange. Let's face it. I mean, this is something unusual is going on there. And, until more information comes out, it's hard to really say anything. But to find him and his wife dead, I don't know.
Yeah, but if anybody hasn't seen The Conversation or Enemy of the State, those are the two best movies.
Well, it's interesting because, of course, Tony Scott, who directed Enemy of the State, he died in a very unusual way, and Gene Hackman was in that movie. That movie touched a very deep thing. Of course, I mean, we're talking about 1999, somewhere in there. So I don't know, how it would play in, but I think it's weird whenever things come out of Hollywood and people have suspicious deaths, it becomes odd. I mean, I spent a long time researching the original Superman and how he died under strange circumstances. There's just something operative there in the heart of Hollywood, and we've tried to touch on it before with our program on Lolita and the fantastic actress there. So, we'll do more of those female target shows as well. Yeah, what do you got?
Twin Water says Young Frankenstein. I forgot he was in that. Of course,
that's
great.
Right. Hackman, he was really, French
he was
Connection.
A diverse actor.
Yeah, he really. What was that one? Was it that he did with Sandra Bullock? I think, where he was an agent, but he really has done some incredible things. Or is that Tom Cruise who's in that one?
Oh, it's The Firm.
The Firm.
Yeah,
yes.
that's great too.
Yeah. So before we get into the UFO side, which plays in heavy tonight on the UFO file, some of the understandings of elementals come into the picture here. And so people who are of an intuitive bent, people who are coming from a psychic side of things, can attune themselves and see elementals. So people like Cayce, for example, had regular conversations with these spirit beings around nature since he was a child. And when he was doing readings later, he started to get into what the nature of the elementals were. And Steiner, Rudolf Steiner, the Austrian mystic, who founded anthroposophy and spiritual science, Steiner's main piece around this is that the elementals are locked in around our own spiritual evolution. So it's very important to understand these things, and that part of the era that we're in is this slight of awareness, this opening up to these other realities. And I'm sure had they been around in time for the UFO file aspect to come in, they would have been talking about that as well. Because I'm sure these things are related, not always the way that we think. Now, one of the things that Cayce had to say was that these are structures and layers of being, And so there are realms that we're tuning into when we're talking about this. So it's not all one thing. Steiner also is very clear when he's talking about other realities and things that there are so many competing interests. It's not like one big happy alliance, as it were, but it's a number of different things that in some ways might even work against each other at times. But in general, the idea of elementals is they bring out, they're from this kind of spiritual side of things, and they bring out the better angels of our own nature, as it were. And I think anyone who's very deep into gardening or any of the stories around anthroposophy and the biodynamic farming, et cetera, will know the story of Findhorn includes a whole interaction with these beings, and that's how they built the most amazing garden over there in Scotland. That's a whole kind of episode on its own, but what I'm going to say here is a few interesting quotes from Cayce around to kind of set the stage, and they're just little indications and give us that little hint. Now, both Cayce and Steiner refer to the elementals in a very interesting way because they'll bring in reincarnation when they're speaking about them. And John Mack, when he's talking about doing some of the regressions having to do with alien abduction, he said that some of the people who were abducted regressed into former lives also. So this overlap between other lives and the interaction with these beings, I find very interesting. And so I have some quotes from John Mack's classic as well. Here's a little bit from Cayce. This entity began its activity as a prodigy, as one already versed in its associations with the unseen, or the elemental forces, the fairies, and those of every form that do not give expression in a material way and are only seen by those who are attuned to the infinite. That's very interesting to me because this person had been Thomas Campbell, who basically started all Protestant thought or unified all Protestant thought. But when Cayce went back through his different lives, he found him as Elisha, working with Elijah, and doing these incredible miracles and things, including raising the dead in the Old Testament. But then he went back and he identified him as Noah, which is one of the most kind of dramatic readings, I guess, in all the Cayce work. It's very interesting because, they did a follow-up reading with this guy 20, 30 years later to find out what kind of life he had. And he had opened a series of supermarket chains in the South. And his life, his great mysticism hadn't really revealed itself as of yet, but I wonder what happened to him. More from Cayce. Brownies, pixies, fairies, gnomes are not elementals. Say what?
Say what?
Say what, entity? But elements that are as definite entities as man is materialized see. So he's trying to say, look, we do refer to them as elementals, but they are actually materialized. They are physical as well. So it's not just that they're, some will-o'-the-wisp character that you kind of is there as a ghost, but it actually has a material footprint. Cayce makes it very clear. And in some of these readings that he gives, he will tell people, the fact that you have this association with these brownies, they give you good business advice.
What?
Yeah. So there were people in these readings who were getting advice from brownies.
Do we know what a brownie looks like?
Well, there's many definitions. I'm going to read some of the looks and show some examples of that. But yeah, it's a good question. So this one person came to him and said, could this moon trail Helena Martin of New York City through the medium of H.S. Hambling supply further helpful ideas concerning the development of oil field properties? And Cayce's answer, rather had this entity best listen to the voices from within that present themselves as the activities about the entity or brownies. Now, so there's a level here where they influence on a psychic level and you get it as intuition. And then other people can actually tune in and see something and interact with it. Now, under ordinary circumstances, if you see something like that, somebody would call you crazy. And yet, here are the mystery schools backing it up and saying, no, people are actually very attuned to this. So this is part of the awakening that the mystery schools were talking about. And part of this was taking place, of course, as the result of this great scientific materialism taking over in the 1840s, as it's identified by the mystery schools, and the mystery schools pushing back and saying, we're going to release these truths as a counterweight to this incredible Ahrimanic phase that humanity is going into, because if we don't, in 100 years, we won't recognize that humanity. This is a key thing because we are the inheritors of that particular mystery school battle that took place in the 19th century. This whole wave that came, the 20th century, the wars, nuclear development, space travel, the whole thing comes out of this period. And we're moving now into the face-off, as it were, of a previous destruction that took place when Atlantis faced up to this incredible technology that it had developed, and the two sides went to war, the Belial and Amelius side. Now, what's interesting is a great deal of that war, the way that it's described by Cayce, involved the elementals, which I find very interesting. And the elementals kind of have this attitude towards humanity of being very bothersome and warlike, which is something that they are not, apparently. But how are we then to explore this idea that these elementals exist on one level, and if we tune into them, we can see them, and then with our modern construct of the UFO file and aliens and things of this nature. Now, there's no proof on the ground that anything has visited us here from another galaxy or another planet or anything like that. However, there are very, very deep indications that there are advanced craft on this planet and advanced craft in space. And then here on Earth, we have those incredible abduction stories that Mac and others gave us, like Bud Hopkins. And when we see the crossover, we always start with the Earth because it's Earth evolution that we're discussing. Then we bring in the planets, then, the whole space aspect, how it relates to Earth, but using Earth always as the center is a good fundamental rule that'll keep us in the right ballpark for this. One of the things and one of the problems when you get around the UFO file, when they talk in very nuts and bolts terms, it doesn't capture it. If you are not including this intuitive, psychic, mystical aspect, you're missing a great deal of it. Just like if you talk about politics without including the UFO file, you're missing a lot of what's going on in the background. And I think the question becomes not so much, is the government dealing with it? Are they aware of other civilizations or other forces that are flying these things? The question is, how much do they know about it? And how much have they figured out? Not do they. They certainly have been observing this other phenomena. And we're going to get into that tonight. I think over the years, a number of researchers have tackled this, and some more successfully than others. And what happened in 2017 was the CIA took over, and all those researchers, went overboard, working with the CIA or being impressed by their new false narrative, which was all to set up a UFO threat. Now, putting that aside, what is the actual good work that's been done around the UFO file? That's what we're going to get into next. And that is the heart of the Dark Journalist X series episode here, 190, X-190. It's psychic elementals in the UFO file. And I want to remind you, of course, we have your questions coming up in the second half of tonight's program. And I want to hear about your experiences, your family's experiences, stories that you've heard. Bring a lot of that in there with your questions there tonight. I think we'll have a very successful data mining operation going on in the ideas room tonight, and really the exchange of those ideas. Because I think what's happening is the ironclad sort of fist that the intelligence community has had on the UFO file is getting wobbly, and something could emerge out of this. And it's either going to be their false narrative or it's going to be the genuine thing that we can push on the other side. And before I go any further, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Doc Roswell says elementals and terrestrial spirits are part 100% of the phenomena, as well as bona fide ETs from other planets/realms. National Labs/CERN scientists study them and are interacting. Excellent subject. Also, Robert Ayala says, DJ, on the subject of the elementals, how important is Irish folklore and geographical place on this subject? And Reverend Carroll says, are elementals what once was the Tuatha De Danann?
Yes. Mm-hmm. The Tuatha De Danann, we did a fantastic episode on them, but that goes back maybe to like 2020, way back there. And it was weird because it was all sort of overexposed. Some weird thing happened to the video. So it's all like, I look like a ghost. But it's pretty interesting because there's no question in the case of the Tuatha De Danann who come up tonight and the Celtic folklore around this, what you're watching is they were very close somehow to this other reality for some reason there in that region between the Celts and the Druids and others. And that's where you get Stonehenge and all the incredible standing stones of Ireland. But in the middle of that is the story about the Tuatha De Danann. And it's interesting because this group is actually recorded in the history of kings of Ireland. So we're not just talking about some legend that hangs out back there in the past, but they have an actual ledger record of them as kings. So they're very well documented, I guess I'd put it that way. Now, one of the things that I've seen with that group that I believe, the way that I've tracked them, is that they're also related to the tribe of Dan, who were seafaring and very unusual tribe over there in Israel. The other thing that's notable about them is when they show up in Ireland, they just come in this kind of cloudy mist, and it seems like they have advanced craft of their own. And they basically make a deal, with the inhabitants there. They say, look, we want half of this island. We won't have any fights. Just leave us to our half. And the group that is there says no, and they go to war. And the Tuatha De Danann people really go on overdrive and win very easily because they're shapeshifters and they can do all kinds of wild things. Well, when you hear about what was going on in some of those periods from the Cayce readings perspective, the Atlanteans went down with such intense two-eye stone technology that when they're showing up in a place that would be fairly primitive or just along the normal evolutionary chart of the era, if they had maintained any of that Atlantean technology, they would have seemed completely supernatural. And in a sense, they would be completely supernatural by comparison. So very often, whenever you hear stories like this, they'll instantly go in, alternative narratives. They'll instantly go to an Ancient Aliens type scenario. And that's fine, except it doesn't always play out because you're not considering the advanced culture of Atlantis here, the Lemurians before them. So these things are well documented coming out of the mystery school traditions, but they're also there, of course, in Plato. And our traditional scientific thinking when it comes to something like Plato, they can't admit that there was this culture there that they missed, so that they say, oh, he must be speaking in myth, etc. So when we've done shows and documentary Hacking Atlantis, the CRAZE and the HOTZONE, if you go deep in there into the Cayce and Steiner sections, you're going to find they give such a picture of Atlantis in its heyday that what you're talking about is a culture that was technologically far advanced beyond our own. Now, this came through a lot during a certain period of time, let's say the 1990s into the early 2000s. But then something happened where even the really good researchers around Atlantis started talking about Atlantis in terms of, well, maybe they were like an industrialized thing, but they didn't have this whole, other piece. So what I maintain in relation to Cayce and Atlantis is the Cayce Atlantis readings are some of the wildest things you'll ever read in your life. There's over 900 of them. And they maintain over a 40-year period a narrative about this advanced culture long before Cayce could have known anything about nuclear power or television or anything like that. When he's doing these readings in the 1920s and 30s, some of these technologies are being rumored and things like that, but his descriptions of this ancient culture possessing this technology are completely off the charts. And so I think we have to take Cayce's hint here about Atlantis, that we're coming back, and that knowledge, that amnesia that overtook humanity is also coming back, and that this is the great awakening in that sense in this period of time. Part of that awakening has to do with the Hall of Records in Egypt, and according to Cayce, it was under the right paw of the Sphinx that the Hall of Records, the pathway therein, still exists. And so the idea that we would have actual Atlantean records is fascinating. But one of the things that he talked about when they asked him about the contents of the Hall of Records was the idea that the two-eye stone construction, the way to construct the two-eye stone, was there. So I believe the Hall of Records became part of these archaeological wars. And in fact, a number of weird things happened to the Mubarak government when they were having people like Zahi Hawass really control the Giza Plateau. And eventually they were so corrupt that they were ousted by the military. And Hawass, he resurfaced with a new job in the middle of all that. But those people, I put this on, and my term for it is Giza Gate. But people like Hawass and Mark Lehner and others came out of the Cayce Institute. Lehner was put through school by the Association for Research and Enlightenment, the Cayce organization. He wrote a book about the Hall of Records and the Sphinx and all the rest. Then he shows up a decade later, and he's the big debunker of all that, and he likes to talk about pottery shards and all, this kind of thing. So it's a very interesting kind of backdrop there. But how the Atlanteans and Cayce's work around the Atlanteans get us into understanding advanced technology that may show up as this UFO file becomes a crucial factor. First of all, it's like a foundational factor. Then you can take a look at off-world civilizations. But what did we have here? That is the question, and we're going to get to that next in this X-Series episode. What else you got?
Oh my God. Everybody's got their little stories. Some of them dark. She Drops Flowers says, my uncle was driving an excavator clearing some land and ran over something. He stopped and saw a couple of little people come out of the woods and grab a body and take it back into the woods. That's just one of the stories. We definitely have people in the ideas room who can see the fairy folk.
Ask that commenter there where generally that took place. I'd be interested to know. Sherlock Holmes. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, right? Incredible, and the deep concepts in Sherlock Holmes. Whenever I've done any research around Conan Doyle, not only was he involved with theosophy, I find him working in all of these psychic institutions in the late 19th century, early 20th century in England. And also he's a part of some Masonic groups, but then he quits. He keeps quitting them, which I find an interesting pattern. One of the things he was convinced of was a totally separate, distinct reality. And I think it shows up in the Sherlock Holmes stories. It's there in a kind of cloaked fashion. But one of the things that he had to say in relation to elementals, and this is from 1919, he says, the recognition of their existence will jolt the material 20th century mind out of its heavy ruts in the mud and will make it admit that there is a glamour and mystery to life. Having discovered this, the world will not find it so difficult to accept that spiritual messages supported by physical facts which have already been put before it. That is the other thing, which is it's one thing to get the evidence. The next question is to be able to accept the evidence. That evidence on the psychic side is there. In general, in normal academia, they don't admit to it, even though, for example, police forces use psychics as psychic detectives, and we have all these stories of these successful crimes being solved through psychic work. We know all about the remote viewing program in the government, and that is the one that's known. There's so many that are unknown and others that we've heard about, and from people like Andrei Puharich and others over the years. And Russell Targ, who ran the SRI remote viewing program, told me on this program about how remote viewers rescued State Department diplomats who were being held hostage. Well, that's about, as high a use for psychic activity as you can get. So certainly they're aware of it and utilize it. That's just a fact. The question is, why is that kept out of public hands? That is the interesting aspect of all this. But in terms of Conan Doyle, one of the things that came up in his era was this very controversial thing about these girls who were from South Africa and emigrated to England, and they had seen these incredible elementals and fairies and things. It was known that there was this strange wave around them in relation to this. But later, during this whole thing, there was pressure on them, I guess, to produce evidence. And then so they produced pictures, and they were very controversial in the period. And I think it's pretty easy to say it was a very early version of Photoshop. But under pressure, they had to produce something. And so they put out these pictures, and Conan Doyle was just entranced with it because he thought, at last I found evidence. And they weren't able to debunk these photos for a long, long time. And at the end of their lives, one of the sisters said, well, maybe there was pressure put on the whole thing to do that. But the picture that we took, this particular picture that we took called number 5, that was during one of these genuine apparitions. And so a number of witnesses had seen these things. The pictures themselves, maybe got the story into trouble later. But this picture I found interesting. And very often you will find that also in relation to the UFO side, which is there's one genuine thing in the middle of all these other pictures that are manipulated. This picture is the number 5 one that the sister pointed out and said was totally genuine at the end of her life. It is very unusual, and it's different from the others, which do look like they've been mechanically engineered. But nonetheless, what's going on there is, in my opinion, Conan Doyle, who was very close with Edgar Cayce, is somebody who's working on behalf of the mystery schools to bring these things out. And so he's giving support to these different investigations to try to get humanity plugged into this idea that you share this world with other consciousness. Now, it's very interesting because when I study the Steiner work in relation to elementals, there's an incredible crossover with that concept. And I'm going to get into that next, going again into Steiner's vision of how these nature beings and how these different consciousness affect us in our own spiritual evolutionary track, and how there's actually a war going on in the middle of all this for all of these influences. And the way he describes it is that it's an harmonic force that is attempting to subvert the natural spiritual evolutionary track of humanity into something else. And that something else sounds very much like AI and virtual reality, even though he was writing 100 years ago. That's where we're going next. Before I go any further, what do you got?
I'm getting such great stuff here. Okay, so that person, before she drops flowers, says it happened on a Mohawk reservation called Akwesasne, I think.
Oh,
the
wow.
woods are said to be haunted, and people say there are lots of things around there.
Is that Arizona?
I don't know.
Interesting.
So a few more. Angel says, I got to meet what I thought was a leprechaun because we traveled on the rainbow to get to the leprechaun world. But it could have been a brownie. Met the family. The pot of gold is awe-sparkling colors.
Weird.
D. Dorothy Papineau says, I saw a shadow person like a small man with a jaunty hat when I was leaving a job. He nodded to me. And Carrie Keegan says, elementals help me energetically clean my home. I am interested in more details about that because we all need to energetically clean our homes all the time.
Weird. Isn't that fascinating? There's a whole culture in northern England that has an ongoing history of elementals doing kind of menial tasks, that they're very involved in, like, gardening, and that I find particularly
they
interesting.
have very specific dharma.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. As signs, as messages, as omens and things as well. So there's some kind of interaction there, and it's almost like they're a mirror image of ourselves if we hadn't completely become human. So there's something in Steiner's work which suggests maybe what that relationship is, and I'm going to use that as a bridge over the elementals into the UFO file. And I believe it's a very solid case, but we'll see. You can let me know when we get there. I want to remind you, if you're new here, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. And I really want to make sure, because sometimes I get people who tell me, well, I didn't get notified and I can't find your stuff. Look, if you're on the newsletter list, you're going to get everything directly in your inbox, and it's free. And it's going to let you know about the amazing interviews we have coming up for you. X-series episodes that will blow your mind. Technology, documentaries, events, the whole thing is there in the newsletter. Go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for that. Yeah, what do you got?
Gypsy Moon says, I saw a fairy in boots dancing with a dwarf.
Whoa.
It just keeps going on and on.
Where was that?
I know.
Here's a couple of things that Steiner had to say. I have a couple of interesting photos around this too, but let's start with this. So this comes directly from Steiner's elemental lectures, of which there's 4 that I know of, but they made a book out of those lectures, literally called Steiner on Elementals. And then I found in the middle of a different lecture this whole interesting section on elementals that didn't seem to be part of that book. But let's get into some of this. These are some of the best excerpts I could find. Quote, someone with trained occult vision who can see behind the physical facts finds immediately behind all that is spread out as color, sound, warmth, and cold, behind all that is embedded in the laws of nature, beings that are not revealed to the external senses. Now, keep in mind that we're talking here, he's speaking about these elementals, and yet keep in mind the UFO file when we mention this as well. Then, as one penetrates deeper and deeper, one discovers, so to speak, worlds with beings of an even higher order. If we wish to acquire an understanding of all that lies behind the sense world, then in accordance with the particular task that has been assigned to me here, we must take our own starting point and what we must find immediately behind the sense world when we raise the first veil that sense perception spreads over spiritual events. As a matter of fact, the world that reveals itself to trained occult vision, where do you get that training? Well, it's all mystery school training. And yet, in Steiner's knowledge of higher worlds, there's a series of exercises to get you on that path. And it's a very easy to digest book as well. It's kind of like Steiner's hit single, as opposed to the album tracks of the other books. As a matter of fact, the world that reveals itself to trained occult vision as the one lying next to us presents the greater surprise to contemporary understanding, to our present powers of comprehension. I am speaking to you who have accepted spiritual science. Therefore, I must assume that you know that immediately behind what meets us externally as a human being, behind what we see with our eyes, touch with our hands, and grasp with our understanding in ordinary human anatomy or physiology, behind what we call the physical body, we recognize the first supersensible human member, the supersensible principle of the human being. We call the etheric body. Now, this is interesting. The mystery schools brought out a series of definitions for bodies that a person has. So the astral body, causal body, etheric body, there's a series of them, in fact. And sometimes people are confused over what's what. Then there is the etheric double, which is an exact duplicate energetically of who you are. And people who are doing holistic energy healing in our culture or in Eastern cultures, you know, some of the masters were doing, is they actually treat that etheric double, because once they treat the double, you're energetically back and it has that impact on the physical body. So the etheric has to do directly with the body. It's like an outline of the physical body. The astral body is different. That's where the whole of your soul experience, when you go into dreams, you're going out into the astral for that. But the etheric body is something that's very close to you all the time. It is your exact outline. That's where the whole thing about auras and all the rest of it come from. And so we're going into a deep track when you look at what's happening on an aura level with a person. Now, in the stories, some of the stories of Edgar Cayce, when he would sit with people when he was conscious, not in a trance state, he could see colors and things around them that would indicate their level of health, the things they were concerned about, and all the rest. But he could also see their past lives in their auras. So if he was talking to one person, he could see, you know, their Native American lifetime or whatever it happened to be while conscious. This is not even in a trance state. I found this interesting because there's a crossover with what Steiner's talking about with occult vision, because he's talking about confronting this incredible, fervent, religious person who just thought that the work that he was doing was the most sinister because it wasn't under the regular church and all the rest. In this case, Catholic Church. And while the guy was freaking out on him, Steiner said behind him, he could see this priest of the Inquisition who was really hardcore and liked to burn people at the stake if they didn't agree with his religious tradition. And he was influencing this priest who was freaking out on him. So we're surrounded, I guess the message from these two leaders of different mystery traditions is that we're surrounded by other beings and other influences. And at a certain point, you know, they asked Cayce, I was like, well, you mentioned discarnates in that last reading. Like, what are discarnates? And he said, beings that are no longer physical. You know, in some cases, people have just, you know, passed into the other realm, or other beings that are here about the earth. And then he says, there are thousands about us here at present. So, you know, the way that they're trying to open up the subject to us is to let us know you're connected to a huge network of things. And so your regular day-to-day conscious is only good for day-to-day kind of things, and that you have to be able to tap into something else if you're going to get any kind of acknowledgement or awareness about what those other things are. And I think in that sense, we're going to start to understand how this UFO file aspect figures in as well. A little more on Steiner. Then we go to John Mack and the UFO file. Then we go to your questions. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's X-Series episode 190, Psychic Elementals and the UFO file. We're taking your questions in part 2, and I want you to share your stories related to these things around elementals or UFOs. In particular, it's going to help lift the interaction in this show, because in this particular episode, It's going to take all of us to really get it across the finish line. And before I go any further, what do you got?
A human being says, we are here to spiritualize matter. That's why working with elementals is so freaking cool. It's what we are here to do. And Bella Clark wants to know, is the etheric body what we see if we see auras?
Yes. According to Steiner and Cayce's work, the etheric body corresponds to the aura. Now, there's an interesting thing. A lot of people may not know this about Russell Targ, but after he was finished, and his books are really powerful, by the way, although he's well known for the remote viewing program and Third Eye Spies and things like that, his books just about kind of exploring psychic information are quite fascinating. But what happened with him was that he started doing psychic diagnostician type work. So he would do these workshops and things, and people would use their psychic abilities to look at things. And when somebody would have an ailment around a particular area, they could see, the people who were tuning into it could see kind of these sparks, literally, coming off their shoulder and things like that. So there's a whole energetic vision that comes into play when you are lifting, raising that vision a little bit. And of course, Cayce, when he's in trance, all he needs is the name and address of the person. So he's lying there in Virginia Beach, and they say, you know, this guy's on Broadway and Fifth in New York City. Let us know, you know. And in some of those cases, Cayce will tune in to the impressions in the apartment that the guy lived in. And then he'll say, well, he's not here yet. There was an accident across town. He's on a bus. He's heading over here, but we'll wait. So, you know, Cayce is kind of like proving there on the psychic side that you can be a satellite and tune into any area, wherever it is. And he demonstrated this in 4 decades of doing these psychic readings. But I think what we get from that also, that he could tune into the impressions in the apartment, that's etheric as well, because you make an impression, people can read those impressions. You know, sometimes some of the best psychics will say, you know, they hold an object of a person, a watch or something like that, and they can tell a great deal about who they are. That's a kind of an energetic signature, as it were.
And it's because everything is in the field.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. It's an energetic field. Okay. Now, some of the lessons around the elemental thing, Steiner brings it in and says, if we don't get the lesson right, actually, the whole environment could become harmonic. And so if it becomes like that, then believe it or not, the destiny of humanity goes awry into this kind of spiritual oblivion. So a little bit on that, and we'll get a little more deep into this. Quote, now it's another lecture on elementals. The significance of spiritual knowledge for man's earthly destiny cannot be emphasized too strongly. Unless man draws near to the spiritual reality, something completely different from what ought to happen will happen to the earth. This is very important. Very often people think, well, it doesn't matter, or the things that I do won't make a difference, or the efforts of good, aware people don't make a difference. No, apparently there's a whole chain of reactions that goes on in the background there. No matter how far or how deeply our sophisticated sciences or physics and chemistry investigate the material world around us, the fact remains that what is investigated will all disappear along with Earth existence itself. In the last resort, chemistry and physics have no value whatever beyond the Earth. When the evolution of the Earth comes to an end, all mineral substances will turn to dust and dissolve in the cosmos. All your computers, all your androids, cyber trucks. Only what pertains to the plant, animal, and human world will pass over into new Jupiter existence. Now, this is very interesting, and I'm sort of jumping ahead on the narrative here, but in Steiner's work, we're building the new Earth, and that is Jupiter. And so the Earth is kind of the staging ground for all this through a process of evolution that'll go on for many more thousands of years. But what he's saying is, this whole clinging to the material part doesn't make sense, because what you're doing is you're building these other assets. Only what pertains to the plant, animal, and human world will pass over into the Jupiter existence. Therefore, all the magnificent achievements of these sciences are related only to what is transitory. It's essential that knowledge is attained of that which endures beyond the Earth. As already mentioned, whatever physical laws are discovered, whatever is investigated concerning the atomic weight of individual elements, or whatever chemical formulas are produced, all these things are concerned only with what has merely transient significance. Humanity must grow beyond the Earth existence through knowledge of the kinds of things I've explained. These are matters of great importance and significance. So what's interesting is, so our emphasis is upside down then with the intense materialism, because what actually is going to survive and what the next stage of our own development is, has this spiritual foundation. And it's very interesting because he identifies humans, plants, and animals. But the other aspects, he is saying, look, don't get too invested in the high-tech reality on this. And then one of the things that he talks about, that if we don't take the message of the elementals and we don't acknowledge them, if we just go on and we don't think about what they represent in terms of our own spiritual evolution, Steiner says, if these elemental beings are disregarded by humanity, that is, if humanity does not turn to spiritual knowledge and the insight that what exists up in the sky is not merely the physical sun, but what with the sun's warmth and light, etheric beings stream down to earth. If man's comprehension stops at the external material aspect, then the possibility exists that these beings will unite with harmonic powers. In order for the earth to become what it was originally intended to become, man must wake up to the dangers that threaten from both sides. On the one hand, the danger of those beings who dwell in the lower elements will join forces with the harmonic powers, and on the other, that the harmonic powers will unite with those of the higher elements that are striving for unity. So I'm going to set the stage on this a little bit here. What Steiner's getting at is actually the acknowledgement and the place that we find ourselves in the evolutionary tract is the awareness of these other beings, whatever they happen to be, including planetary beings, elementals, the various things we've been talking about here. But he's also saying that those beings, without the human interaction and without the kind of leadership of humanity, may find themselves in a position where, the harmonic forces are not only working to have humanity enslaved, but they may enslave the entire elementals kingdom. So there's a great need in Steiner's work, and this runs into a very deep track. There's a great need in our own conscious state to be able to contact and interact with those elemental forces. Now, I'll tell you what's also interesting when we get around the UFO file aspect of this and the whole concept of aliens, etc., is that he says in 1900 there was a whole new form of elemental that was created in that period directly for this interaction with humanity. That makes you start to wonder, are some of the aspects around the alien piece related to this? And is somebody interfering with that process? That's where we're going to go next, and that will take us into the work of Dr. John Mack, Harvard professor who I was lucky enough to get to know and at least have a few conversations with. But I had a friend who worked for him, and boy, those details to my 18, 19-year-old mind certainly got me thinking pretty deeply back then. So I'll share a couple of those stories with you. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's X-Series 190. And this is Psychic Elementals in the UFO File. And we're all psychic detectives tonight. We're taking your stories and questions in the second half of tonight's program. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
People are saying their dogs are freaking out during this episode.
Oh,
It's
really?
Yes, very interesting.
Huh. Wow.
Okay, so
Maybe there's a Terminator on the horizon.
Coral-colored flicker feather says, we were bathing naked in Vermont and a leprechaun was watching us from on top of a waterfall. My husband and I both looked at each other and said, do you see that? Shane Walker says, met a guy named Oz in Santa Cruz that found an imperial sand dollar, and the next day he saw a merman with a staff standing in the ocean. Oz asked him if he lost something, and he said, that's yours now.
Oh.
I mean, this is really interesting. I thought everybody had ghost stories. I would not have expected so many people would have elemental stories. This is fascinating to me.
Oh, it's really great, and Vermont is absolutely fascinating. Of course, I spent a lot of time up in Vermont. I went to school up there, and one of the things I remember about walking around in places like Burlington and Montpelier and stuff was people would come up with the greatest names for me when I was walking around. I get called weird things like Nicolas Cage and drug dealer and things of that nature. So Vermont holds a very special place in my memory. Okay. Now, Dr. John Mack, I want to show you this image first. There's a very interesting painter who I promise to get into more in depth in an upcoming episode named Lenora Carrington, who was a British woman, fascinating woman who was associated with Max Ernst and was a very controversial artist of his period who the Nazis were after heavy, and as the Nazis were after Steiner. And she ended up going to Mexico and living there for years. And she brought forward some of the most amazing artwork about elementals that has ever been seen. But one of them was in relation to the Tuatha De Danann, this Irish group, again, this mystical group. And the picture here that she drew, this is before the Greys were really out there as a popular item in culture. And she'd been painting since the 1930s. But I'll get the exact date on this. I think this painting probably falls in the late 40s somewhere. Take a look at these characters here in that painting. This is the Tuatha De Danann, according to Lenora Carrington.
If you just stare at that,
yeah,
that would help you develop psychic ability.
There's no question. And, she put together a tarot deck and did some incredible things. But one of the things that Steiner put across about certain artists around the period of 1920, which was before her, but it was this era that he was discussing, and he was saying that they could embed in the artwork things that would open up the 21st century mind when we were ready for it. And so Hilma af Klint, others along this line, but certainly Carrington is one I wanted to bring our attention to because it appears to me that she's tuning in again to these gray entities. Now, the Tuatha De Danann, of course, that shot of them coming into Ireland, and they just have this otherworldly glow coming in. And again, the unusual aspects that come up in relation to their appearance, including the reports that they glow, that they shapeshift, that they can disappear on a dime, all take us into that Apium realm of ET UFO experience, but also advanced X technology. And so that brings us into this whole piece about the Atlantean X technology. So that Apium thing that takes place is definitely based on a very ancient secret about something that was discovered back there that gave the Atlanteans the ability to do all these incredible things, including make all these incredible monuments around the globe that still function as some kind of electric grid. Yes.
Okay, Debbie McAdoo is desperate to get that Tuatha De Danann picture. What should she look up?
Oh,
to
it's
get a
Lenora
copy?
Carrington.
Okay.
Yes, and if you just look up her whole Tuatha De Danann series, you'll see it there. She is quite remarkable. I'll post some of Lenora's work, but we have an episode on her coming up, so I'm going to save some of that. And she is all that, you know, she's just as good as advertised. And unfortunately, she's no longer with us, but my goodness, I think she was around for about 90 some odd years. And during that time, gave us incredible legacy of this inter-between artwork. I guess it's a good way.
Right, and
to call
she's
it.
an incredible, just even looking at her eyes, like this Celtic gypsy woman, right, with psychic eyes.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, she is. She's compelling herself. I mean, the photographs are very electric. I'm sure there's a lot of psychic activity going on there. How do you get to elementals, Tuatha De Danann, you know, and all these other things without having some heavy duty psychic aspect happening? All right, a little more Steiner on the elementals, then to John Mack. Okay, here we go. The elemental beings of the air have developed to a high degree what lives in the human will. It is splendid that the analytical chemist discovers the atomic weight of hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, and that he finds out how hydrogen and oxygen combine into water to be further analyzed, or else how chloride is analyzed, and so on. But elemental spiritual beings are active behind all of this. And it is essential that man should acquire insight into their characteristics. During the period in which man developed the intellect, as already mentioned, this was from the first third of the 15th century to the end of the 19th century, these elemental beings were pushed to one side, as it were. While the intellect played a creative part in man's cultural life, there was not much they could do. And because the elemental beings dwelling in solids had, in a certain sense, to hold back and leave the intellect to man, they also held back the beings of water and air. But now we live in a time when the intellect has begun to decline within the civilized world. It is failing, and it is falling into decadence. Boy, is that true. If mankind does not become receptive to what streams toward him from the spiritual world, then the result of this dullness, and this is a word that he uses often, on humanity's part will be, and there are signs already of it happening, that these elemental beings will gather together to form a kind of union and place themselves under the leadership of the supreme intellectual power of Ahriman. So it's almost Steiner back there in 1920 signaling this alarm bell of all the other things he sees about Ahriman. But he also sees Ahriman interfering in the elemental spiritual worlds because of our own lack of knowledge and awareness and interaction with these consciousness beings. So that's some food for thought there, having Ahriman take over the elementals. I think that is a very arresting development, as it were. Now, how does that relate to the UFO file? Let's go there next. What do you got?
Okay, yeah. Barry 7676 says, I've seen a large dark figure in a graveyard they call Hobbit Hill in southern Illinois, Wayne County.
Oh.
Described what I've seen to some people, and they told me I saw a death elemental.
Whoa.
And Christian P. Norris says, I met a very tiny man in the Redwoods once, all dapper and ancient. Seemed he knew me.
Oh, isn't that fascinating? You know, that reminds me of a very strange story where, you know, Cayce had this woman who came to him, and she came to get a reading, but she came too late. You know, her illness had progressed along this track, and he gave her a reading, and, you know, they did what they could. But after she died, he had this very unusual dream, and this person knocked on his door, and they were all dressed up, and they were jolly, and they had rosy cheeks and stuff. And Cayce realized it was death, kind of gentleman death. And he said, well, you're different than anyone would expect, you know, like people have always pictured you with a sickle and all these different things. And he says, oh, yes, you know, like it's just the birth, the pathway into a new experience. And I'm kind of the person who takes them there. And at a certain point, he says, you know, it's just a transition, and that transition happens. And he took a point between Cayce's, right between his eyebrows, and pointed there and said, don't you know, in that spot, it relates directly to the silver cord of life. And he said, older people instinctively kiss that in a child as like the passing on of their wisdom and knowledge, and the child gains knowledge and the older person gains hope. So this whole thing about the figures who are, you know, sort of ambassadors of that astral realm or whatever, it's very interesting. I think Cayce's dream there, his vision, gives us some hint that it's not as morbid a process in some ways as we've been told. What else you got?
This is incredible. Linda Pinty said, how about Iceland? Almost all the folks there believe in the little people, and they, for example, have to get their permission if they're going to build something. Doc Roswell says, yep, law in Iceland says that a shaman must be consulted before any major construction project in virgin landscape to avoid disturbing the nature spirits after many incidents in the 1950s. Also, Gracious Lady says, when you live in Hawaii, you know about the minihunas, the little people. I read they were there in the census some 40 years ago.
Oh, wow.
That's amazing.
Wow.
C.A. Beverforden says the Clan McCulloch chief had an interaction with a fairy that asked him not to build a ditch where he was digging because it was where the fairies lived, so he did not build there.
Oh, wow.
This is incredible.
Well, it's interesting, you know, the end of that Tuatha De Danann story is that eventually their rulership goes under and the regular people kind of overthrow the Tuatha De Danann, and in one final battle, they go underground. And so the banshees and the different folklore of Celtic legends has this overhang that there are these mounds where the Tuatha De Danann disappeared down into. But that is quite fascinating. It reminds me, there was a fascinating film by Herzog, and he did a movie called Where the Green Ants Dream, which was an Australian movie in the 80s. And this is such a strange movie, but it was based on what was actually happening. So it's kind of half documentary, half movie, where there was a tribe there that only 12 of them spoke the dialect. And so it was a very small group, and it was hard to communicate back and forth. And so these builders had come in, and they were so worried, this tribe, because there was a place there that they called Where the Green Ants Dream, and the green ants dreamed reality. So if they got rid of the place, then the green ants would stop dreaming up this reality. And so they were really worried, oh, wait, the world is going to end if you do this. So that became an actual court case. And I think it is very, very interesting there what somebody said about Iceland, because there's a Cayce story about him encountering in Kentucky as a teenager an elemental who was very disturbed by the construction pattern that was going on, sort of getting rid of these farms and putting up these residential communities. And he had a huge, Cayce had these incredible interactions with nature spirits always, and always talked to plants and all kinds of things. So he lived in a different reality from most of us. But in general, the elemental was saying that those beings don't trust humanity at all. That's been kind of their track record. And so they were unhappy with the things that we're doing. And it's very interesting because when you think about it just in terms of the larger picture, we're always talking about, life on Earth and the meaning of life on Earth and things of this nature. Obviously, that higher spirit of nature would have problems with the way that we run the planet. There's just no question about it. So I think, again, on the mystery school side, they're inserting this reflection aspect and saying, look at some of these other realities and other beings. Don't be locked into this very, very narrow corridor of a kind of scientific materialism when you consider these things. And also, according to Steiner and Cayce and others, the elementals are incredibly helpful for anything. That's also fascinating. Everything from literature to scientific inspiration and other things. They're there. They're somehow involved in that process. How becomes very interesting. And when we think about the alien abduction experience in relation to that, then we really start to wonder what's going on there. Is that interference in that process? And so that's what we're going to find out next. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series episode X-190, and it is Psychic Elementals in the UFO File. I'm going to read through some of this John Mack work, and then we're going to go to your questions. How does that sound?
Sounds great.
What do you got?
Doc Roswell says, real feng shui is all about appeasing/working with nature spirits and, quote, corpse roads, which exist invisibly in the landscape. And Earth Steward says, in Bali, they always consult and appease the lower elementals before their ceremonies. And
Isn't
of
that
course in
interesting?
Japan, Fulcanelli mentioned Shintoism, which is, they have all kinds of ceremonies for nature spirits.
Yeah, there was this whole idea. It's very interesting because, of course, upon reflection, it looks like a heavy dose of superstition or whatever. But it seems like what we're looking at is they always had to acknowledge spirits of the air. Always had to acknowledge the different spirits, the harvest spirits, and things of this nature. So they're more connected, and we lost some of that with industrialization, obviously. The question is, how essential is that lost, and how do you reconnect it after you've gone through 400 or 500 years of this industrialization, especially in the kind of dangerous technological environment that we're in now? And how to use that technology as part of the whole evolutionary track, as opposed to, for example, bringing war into space, which doesn't sound like such a good idea, right? I'm sure that's why we have the Star Wars movie. Okay. Couple of quick things about a particular being associated with abduction called a mantis, like praying mantis or mantid being.
Right on.
And Mac dealt with it. Linda Moulton Howe, of course, has some great stories about it. The mantis-like beings have sparked intense discussions among researchers. Some draw parallels between the reported aliens and insect on our planet. Could gray aliens represent worker bees, while praying mantis figures represent kind of a queen bee? The intrigue doesn't stop here. According to Linda Porter, who had these intense interactions with these beings, and I'll show a little bit of her artwork too, these aliens have a keen interest in the human soul. They seem perplexed by its essence, curious about where it travels after death. Linda Porter spoke of witnessing humans in a form of suspended animation, encased within cylinders, raising questions about the extraterrestrials' role in studying the human spirit and possibly even the cycle of reincarnation. Her story is interesting. She gets abducted in 1963 before really this whole wave of abductions happened. The Betty and Barney Hill story had happened, but it hadn't been publicized. It doesn't get reported until, even though it happens in 61, it doesn't get reported really in earnest until 65. And so she's, experiencing these things. And a little bit about her abduction. In a tranquil farming town named Covina, nestled on the outskirts of Los Angeles in 63, the unimaginable happened. 17-year-old Linda Porter's life took an eerie turn one night, propelling her to the center of one of the most mysterious alien abduction stories of the era. She recalled waking up aboard an unfamiliar spacecraft surrounded by blinding lights and sounds she had never encountered before. Guided by a small gray creature, she was led into a room where she met another being, an almost 8-foot-tall figure resembling a praying mantis. This wasn't the typical gray alien story we've often heard of in pop culture. What sets Linda's story apart is its timeline. The incident predates the popularization. Throughout her teens and 20s, she claimed to have several encounters with these otherworldly beings. She told her story to a number of different researchers. Now, some of her images I found compelling. This has a kind of Apium thing written all over it. Again, they're coming directly through the wall. And whenever you get those types of Apium effects happening, the reality distortion phenomena is taking place. That's what Apium is all about. So climbing through the walls, being abducted through things, and all the rest. This is the shot that she drew of the being who was guiding her. Now, that's pretty elemental-ish. You have to say that. It doesn't look like something that would come from another planet and fly here, does it? It looks like something pretty much from here. And it has incredible wisdom, but they talked about soul transfer and some unusual things, and she saw what looked like a double of herself in one of those tubes. Now, John Mack's work as a psychiatrist at Harvard, he may have regretted. He has a very interesting FBI file, by the way.
Interesting.
Mack was already way before his UFO work, was already tracked heavily by the FBI. And by the time he gets around people like Bud Hopkins and stuff, he gets intrigued, and then he falls into the UFO thing. And then he starts to have these UFO abductees as clients, and then he creates groups, and then Harvard finds out about it. He gets into trouble. They put him on the cover of Time magazine, and they're like, heretic. And it's none of this embracing New York Times, CIA, Lou Elizondo stuff, So whenever the CIA wanted to turn on that whole let's embrace this abduction UFO thing, they could do it anytime. But when a real person stumbles into it on their own, they have to block that. And if you go back, the stories of the period are vicious on Mac. But I had an interesting couple of conversations with him, and I had a friend who worked with him, so I found out a little bit about what he was doing there, including trying to prevent people from being abducted by giving them astral instructions not to be taken and things, and setting up cameras around where people were being abducted and things of that nature. He's a very unusual guy. You got a chance to meet him as well.
I did.
It's your
incredible eyes.
Same impression.
Very magnetic. I mean, magnetic doesn't even come close to describing. He'd just pull you right in. Very sexy.
He was very serious, I think. He was very serious about the work he was doing. And, he understood that the whole thing had been manipulated, but he wanted to get to the bottom of it. And he wasn't intimidated by being called out in this fashion. Here's a few things that he tuned into in his abduction book, which I think is the best of the bunch. And it's early. It's 1994. Okay, here's some Apium for you. After the initial contact, the abductee is commonly floated down a hall, through the wall, or through the window of the house, or through the roof of the car. They are usually astounded to discover that they are passed through solid objects, experiencing only a slight vibratory sensation. So that's complete suspension of any of the laws of physics we know, dematerialization, things of this nature. That is the Apium effect being activated. And it's what I've referred to as the Apium effect. I suggest that the X-Protect group that holds the UFO file, the reason that the secrecy level has been so high is because of the Apium effect. Not because it comes from aliens, not because it's an off-world technology or whatever, but because it has this Apium effect, and they although they've made great strides in adopting the Apium effect for a number of different things, they can't control it or sort of aim it. It can have kind of a boomerang effect, and in terms of what it does, since it completely distorts reality, they can't control it the way you ordinarily would. Okay. Now, in most cases, a beam of light seems to serve as an energy source or ramp for transporting the abductee from the place where the abduction starts to a waiting vehicle. Usually the experiencer is accompanied by 1, 2, or more humanoid beings. Think of Betty and Barney Hill. This whole group is accompanying them walking along. As a matter of fact, when Barney Hill first sees them, when he unusually pulls up this side of this mountain under a kind of subconscious command, he wants to know, he says, wait a minute, with all these guys on the road, are we being robbed? Is that what's going on here? That's right on the Barney Hill tapes. So it's a group standing around. Except it's a group of grays in that case. Or beings that are kind of like grays. I wouldn't say that the Betty Hill characters are grays if you look at Junior. Experiencing only a slight vibratory sensation. Okay. At some point early in this process, the experiencer discovers that he's been numbed or totally paralyzed by a touch of the hand or instrument held by one of the beings. Abductees may still be able to move their heads and usually can see what is going on, although frequently they close their eyes so they can deny or avoid experiencing the reality of what's occurring. The terror associated with this helplessness blends with the frightening nature of the whole strange experience. You know, when I met Charlie Fultz, who was part of the Allagash incident, fascinating guy, and when he was telling me the story, he was kind of re-experiencing it. This is part of the timelessness of the abduction experience I've noticed also, which is kind of Apium in live time. And it's happened to me in a few descriptions where, you know, someone was describing to me this experience of seeing this ship in their backyard at the age of 6 and then go touching the control panel. And then while they were talking about this whole experience, I started to feel like I was there, you know, experiencing. I was like, that's this weird feeling. And I remember talking with Gigi Young about the experience and this person telling me the whole thing. And as I was telling her, she was like, oh yeah, I feel like I'm there doing it too. So there's some resonance from the thing that jumps from energy person to energy person. Now, here's a few things. Here's some speculation that's thrown in at the end of the MacBook that I found interesting. Is it possible these races are only semi-human, so that in order to maintain contact with us, they need to crossbreed with men and women of our planet? Is this the origin of the many tales and legends where genetics plays a great role, the symbolism of the Virgin in occultism and religion, the fairy tales involving human midwives and changelings, some of the sexual overtones of the flying saucer reports, and biblical stories of intermarriage between the Lord's angels and terrestrial women, whose offspring were giants? From that mysterious universe are higher beings projecting objects that can materialize and dematerialize at will. And I think it's worth noting that they're not all the same experience. They are, you know, for example, that thing about the Elohim and the giants and all the rest. It's not alien as in some being that came here from Alpha Centauri in that sense. The Elohim aren't like that. They come, though, from a different stage of evolutionary, and they obviously track, and they obviously have some interaction with the development of humanity. So, you know, it is interesting to me sometimes because it's very interesting to look at different artwork, for example, the way a von Daniken type guy would. And I think that they've done us a service by looking at things this way, but it also cuts out too much. And you can look at something that has a headdress on and say, hey, that looks really like, you know, they have oxygen up their nose and a radio receiver in their ear and all this stuff. That's the Atlantean overlay. There's no question about it. And the idea of them just being ancient astronauts visiting here and all the rest. If we get a real grasp on what's happening in the past, I think what we can do is say the Atlantean culture, and I think there's a very, very good background in the mystery schools for how far it got. The Atlantean culture went to such a level with the technology that anything that could be attributed to amazing aliens coming here and doing all this stuff could be directly attributed to the Atlanteans. The question is, who are the Atlanteans and why were they so exceptional? And so when you get now into this aspect of the alien part, you have to ask the question, is any of that stuff related to the technology from Atlantis? And then the other question is, how does it relate in terms of the different levels? Now, humanity doesn't even understand a great deal about the elementals, which apparently have been side by side with us for thousands of years. So understanding this other phenomena, you know, the idea that, hey, you could just get disclosure and understand what aliens are, is very foolhardy. What I think is important is, and there may well be an off-world aspect to it, and yet, isn't it compelling that we have deep, deep mystery school information telling us the Atlanteans could go anywhere in the universe? So they had some deep level of space travel. So where does that get us into this? One of the answers might be in something else that Mac has to say. So I'll read the Mac quote and then we'll jump to your questions.
Okay, sounds good.
All right. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Whew, deep into the esoteric tonight. X-190, Psychic Elementals, and the UFO File. The work of John Mack coming back into the fore for this. When experiencers ask me about the status of their experience in the non-ordinary state, I can only say that the elements of their story have appeared again and again in the stories of other individuals who are not, for example, mentally disturbed. I note that the feelings and emotions that they have shown me seem quite real, and I explore other possible explanations for feelings that intense. Finally, I tell them that I have no answers and that we are investigating these experiences together. I like that as a general rule, because I think you can get somewhere if you're exploring things together, and if you're not, arriving at conclusions too prematurely. One of the other things I want to say here is that very often people would say to him, well, the alien experience and the abduction thing is just hiding this sexual trauma from when somebody was 4. Max said in the cases that he got, that he found 0, and I mean 0, cases where the person had been molested and then had an abduction experience. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but it was not a factor in any of his work. So I thought that was pretty significant as well. This fellow, who spent a great deal of time on the UFO subject, J. Allen Hynek. First, he was the Project Blue Book debunker. He did work with Lloyd Berkner and the Robertson panel. Of course, that's J. Allen Hynek. He told the story about how the Robertson panel was done and how they would go into this theater in 1953 and see the best images and videos that you've ever seen of UFOs anywhere. And then people like Berkner and others would go up to him and yell in his ear, "You didn't see anything. That was the planet Venus. That was a misidentified bird." And he also said that they were putting him in this theater and it was cold. So it was intentionally uncomfortable. And it was all to disorient him for the report so that he wouldn't know exactly what was going on. But Hynek eventually got out of all that, and in the 70s, with his research, became the foundation for Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which was the Spielberg movie, and was really the leader of the whole UFO investigation movement in the period. Hynek said, privately to his aide, and the conversation is on record, you know what? The entire answer to this mystery, I believe, lies in this book. And then he held up the book. The book is Rudolf Steiner's Theosophy. Now, I thought about that.
J. Allen Hynek said that?
He did. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. It's extraordinary. And what's interesting to me is what he said was, the whole mystery around the alien experience is in here. And I thought about Theosophy because it's one of those books that really does stand out in the canon of work of Rudolf Steiner, because it's not about the Theosophical movement at all. It's just about his own different impressions. And in this book, he talks extensively about elementals. And that, I believe, is very interesting, the coming together of two different worlds. An academic, scientist, researcher who's been involved in government disinformation, came out of it and became the leader of trying to bring forward the real UFO file, and coming together with this researcher from the 1920s who was doing spiritual science and said, humanity needs to acknowledge this aspect. Those two things coming together. And with that, Miss Olivia, I'm going to turn it over to you and your questions.
Well, I wanted to start. You did not mention, I think it's George Hunt Williamson, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Secret Places of the Lion.
Do I have the right one? Is he the one that was inspired by the elves? Or?
Oh, yeah. No, I do. That's George Ellery Hale.
Ah, yes. Okay. I knew it was 3 names.
Yes. He is the subject of the Sun King episode, which I think is X-Series. It's like X-Series 150 or something. But look for the Sun King episode and Ellery Hale mystery. That has all the information. It's a 3-hour tour de force on George Ellery Hale. And of course, Hale was very fascinating and put together the Palomar Observatory, still the most extraordinary observatory. And Albert Einstein visited him and all the rest. One of the things that is little known about what he was doing there at the observatory and at Caltech and stuff is he was installing all this imagery of the pharaoh Akhenaten and the sun god and, A10, the sun rays coming down. And he did have, an unusual nervous disposition and all the rest of it, but he went into a sanitarium for rest, as they called it in that period. And he said during that period, he was visited by an elf, and the elf told him all about how he was going to build the Palomar Observatory and who to go to and the people to get and the things to do. So it's this very, very unusual thing. And then later, his family and the endowment and the Rockefellers and all the rest were embarrassed by this story and said, oh, no, that was just a little fantasy he had while he was in the sanitarium. Ha, 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 But no, he was very adamant about it. And he had, he lived with some kind of a knowledge of that interbetween. So, yeah, his story is absolutely off the charts. Yeah.
I want to ask about sort of mental illness or, I think you can see already where I'm going with this.
Sure.
People who have had these apotheum effects with these otherworld beings, is it that people who are, somebody might say that they're mentally ill or
yeah, well,
sensitive?
Betty Hill experienced all the apotheum effects. Time missing, floating, compass spinning backwards, all sorts of things that, she and Barney Hill experienced almost the full range of apotheum effects. She had no mental problems. Neither did Barney. And the disturbance, what's interesting is when you look at that story, and I think it is important to revisit that one because it's one of the most solid, and it has a track record of time. But Barney Hill's life did disintegrate, as a matter of fact. It's not really talked about a lot, but he dies within a few years at the age of 46. And during the time after the abduction, he stops working. So he's no longer able to do the job where he was driving from Portsmouth, New Hampshire to South Station, doing this postal route and working at the South Station post office in Boston. And a little while after that, he has to stop and he just kind of goes down. So he couldn't handle and process the entire thing. And I think you can hear that in the tapes as well. And James Earl Jones does an incredible performance as Barney Hill in the movie from the 70s. But I look at a lot of the people who've had those experiences, the ones I've talked to who've had the contact experiences. And I guess we're lucky in a sense in Boston because of the Mac thing, the whole thing about the abduction groups and things of that nature around Boston and Cambridge, there were a lot of people who were involved with that. And I knew a lot of them over the years. But there are always people around the alien thing that are off kilter. There's no question about it. But you do around politics, you get people who are off kilter. Around sports, you get people who are off kilter. That's just, it's just a particular variety. But I do think that there is, there's a fascination that lends itself to obsession when it comes to the UFO file aspects around abduction and aliens and things like that. So, yeah, it is very important. Obviously, Mac was in a position to assess these people in terms of their mental illness, and he found over and over again, no, like very few of the people who came to him were like that, and he only worked with people who didn't have those types of afflictions. Yes.
Joseph Tuga says there are a lot of vets who've had UFO experiences in the VA psych wards. I'd like more information on that. That is interesting.
That makes sense.
Ratboy Genius says, is part of the Apium effect a separation or interference of the etheric and astral body from the physical body, something related to but not the same as dreaming?
Here's what I can tell you from all of the studying of abductions. That the thing that seems to happen is that the experience is able to disrupt what are normal fields of physics in our everyday physical reality. So I think it's important to note that some of the things that take place in terms of a blackout of a town after a craft is seen going through, or mechanical devices not functioning. All the stories, the early stories in the 60s and 70s of alien interaction is the car always stops, so there's an electromagnetic impression right off the bat. And when it goes further into an abduction experience, if you get the really kind of raw ones, like the Betty and Barney Hill case and others, before it becomes so popularized that you could say, well, this thing is happening in a pattern because somebody's seen this in a movie or read it in a book. Those experiences make it very clear that the people are interacting with something which is not acknowledged generally. Now, the question is the government aware of it? If they weren't aware of it in the 1940s, they became aware of it. But certainly they were aware of it a long time before that. And after becoming aware of it, it became their goal to suppress all the groups that were working around it or infiltrate them and just get the thing under their own umbrella to study the Apium effect and the advanced technology aspects that they could bring out of it. So, and they did invent their own line of abductions, the whole military MyLab aspect where they imitated a typical abduction experience, which muddied the waters. But if you go to the genuine experiences that people have had, very often, like in the case of the Charlie Foltz experience, when they come out of it, the two twins who were mass art teachers in that case, their abilities were heightened dramatically when they came out of it, on one hand. On the other hand, one of their epilepsy, one of them had epilepsy and it became worse. So this sort of mixed bag thing. It seems to exaggerate and bring different qualities out of that person. What I tend to think is that it's absolutely real, one. Two, it's coming in from a different order of things. And three, now that it's kind of worn off in culture, if you go back, you can see that, for a good 20-year period, it was really heavy. They were bombing the base on this. But now that aspect hasn't been exaggerated so much, if you really go back and read the cases of people of Mac and others, they're pretty unusual in terms of what takes place. So if people, are engaging with a thing and it changes size, for example, well, that is a really key aspect that Steiner says in terms of the elementals, that they can change their size, that they can change their appearance. There's an aspect of certain elementals where they're shape-shifting, so you can never sort of get your hands on them because they can turn themselves into anything. A lot of that aspect of the elemental work that Steiner's bringing in sounds like it has something in common with that abduction experience. The question is, now that we can clear back all the movies and all the rest of it, people have had generations and generations of abduction experiences now. So it's part of the human story. It's part of our own story. Forget about the government. Forget about, the counterintelligence people telling you what it is. But there's enough there, I think, to work with to get to some good answers. Yes, what do you got?
Okay. A human being says, our unpurified astral bodies will interfere with vision when we see something. Keep in mind the main message from Steiner in knowing things is to, quote, know thyself. Our spiritual and physical go hand in hand. Our highest state on Vulcan will be when we are truly in the physical.
Oh, yeah. There's no question. This is a quote, speaking of Steiner, this is a quote about some of that shape-shifting aspect. Beings of whom we cannot even say that they are continually changing their form, for strictly speaking, they have no form at all. They appear flashing like lightning, like little meteors flashing and disappearing with really no definite form. They flit over our Earth, flashing and vanishing like meteors or will-o'-the-wisps. We hear about orbs and things and all the rest of it. Here Steiner is talking about an order of being that's doing that, that's flashing in and out. He's not saying, well, it's an alien ship that has all this advanced propulsion and all the rest. Steiner has this to say again around this. There are other beings also possessing only body and soul, which are no longer visible to the physical senses. In various occult teachings, they're often called elemental spirits, but actually to call them elemental spirits shows the greatest possible ineptitude. For it is just spirit that they do not possess. It is better to call them elemental beings. In the meantime, let us accept as a kind of definition that such beings consist of body and soul. In the absence of direct perception, our first concern is to gain as far as possible some idea of these elemental beings. They are also spoken of as nature spirits. In fact, they have been given many different names. The name, however, does not matter. What is necessary is that we create a certain concept of them. Some acknowledgement that this is something that's taking place. Yes, what do you got?
I realized I need to read Behaving as if the Life in All Life, what that book was, Behaving as if the...
All Life Mattered?
Yeah, what is the,
Oh, yeah. That was kind of a big book there.
yeah, and Paralandra and all that. I was really into that back in
Oh,
the day.
Paralandra.
Yeah,
Wow.
that was incredible
Yeah.
stuff. Especially since we need to work on gardening and really connect to the soil
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, there's no question.
and regenerate the soil and all that.
I think people who do that are going to have a fantastic advantage.
The God
in
and
the
all life
future.
mattered. That's what it is.
Oh, right.
Oh my God,
Behaving
so
as
obvious.
if the God, yes. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We're here in X Series 190. Wow, Paralandra. Woo. You know it's deep when you're talking about Paralandra. And Findhorn fits in there too. Elementals in the UFO file. Largest strawberries you've ever seen. We're going to take a few more questions here, and we'll continue to go down into this elemental UFO overlap. And I want to remind you, especially if you're new here, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter, but it keeps us in touch with all the amazing things we have coming up for you. X-Series episodes, mind-blowing interviews, documentaries, of course, the Hacking Atlantis, CRAZE and the HOTZONE documentary series is something we're shooting right now. The first episode of that is available on this channel. And also live events and things like that, all there in that newsletter, free newsletter. Go to darkjournalist.com and plug in your email to make sure that we can get you that information. Europe.
Okay, Food Provider. Some say greys are biorobots, i.e. living machines. How does this compare to elementals and perchance the things Cayce references?
Well, that is an excellent question. Cayce, all right, remember this. In Cayce's readings, he talks about the Atlanteans created basically cyborgs. And they would have them do all of the work for them. The problem is that they mingled in this kind of clone laboratory, some human and some animal, whatever that was required for what they were doing. And so this became a real problem, because when the Atlanteans would go into different places during the destruction, when they were running away from the destruction in Atlantis and would go into a place like Egypt, they'd have all of these things with them. And Cayce spoke of them as things, untouchables. And so that type of technology was used to create that. Obviously, we're building into that right now with our own robots. We've all seen the Boston Dynamic things. And, Musk brags about the fact that he's building an army of clones, not clones, but of robots. So, these people are thinking on this level, and so they don't have any ethical guardrails. I think that is the fundamental problem with the era that we're in, that a lot of the leadership doesn't have that ethical grasp. And so this is the great challenge for humanity in this period, where the technological ability has gone far beyond the wisdom here. But Cayce was giving us a huge hint, saying in this kind of Frankenstein way that there was the divorcing of the spiritual element by the creation of these creatures, because they have some human animal elements to them, but they're, they function as automatons. And that whole automaton echo hangs out there. So we're entering another period where they're talking about, hey, you can have all these AI robots do all your work for you. But we also have this weird, hey, let's clone humans and pigs and all this other stuff for organs and all the rest. How long until those two processes meet? Well, I'm sure they already have. They've been experimenting on this stuff for a while. So that's a dangerous threshold for humanity, and it denies the entire spiritual relationship. That, I think, is what Cayce was getting at with it. Remember when he was Rata, and there's that fantastic painting by Nanette Christ, and it's really transformative painting if you look at her version of Rata there. Rata is quite fascinating because he's Cayce as the high priest who comes into Egypt, and he will go and spend all this time in Atlantis, and he will gather up with all the initiates this incredible information to store in the Hall of Records. and working, with Hermes and all the rest. But what's fascinating about him is when Cayce gives the background on him, he says, well, he was a daughter of Zu without a human father. So it's not explained what that means. Does that mean an Elohim was his father? Some other being was Rata's father. But Rata becomes the one who makes it his goal to transform the things into full human beings. And so he's taking these, human cyborg mixtures and making them human over generations through the Temple Beautiful in Egypt that he sets up there. And it's in his calculations that we get all the calculations for the Great Pyramid, and that they place the Hall of Records under the Sphinx. Now, he's gone and spent all that time around the world gathering up that knowledge. And so I think when Cayce comes back, all of that Rata is back there somewhere in that silver cord, bringing forward that information from a past life. And so that's why you get the incredible knowledge about the Atlanteans and their interaction with the early Egyptian culture. So these things run deep, and there's a kind of fingerprint, mystical fingerprint, in the work, whether you're dealing with Blavatsky or Cayce or Steiner, that is to set us up, is to give us a foundation going into the 21st century. And, that's the way the mystery schools work. It's not something that is pushed upon like a cult, comes down on you. They lay the information out, and then who picks it up? How does humanity respond to it? Remember, Steiner was incredibly disappointed when World War I was in its full swing by 1915, 1916. And he said, well, the mystery schools in some sense have failed because they didn't get the right information out to stop this. And for my part, I'm going to release all the secret stuff we have in anthroposophy because there's no sense in holding it back from humanity. These are the types of things, there's foundations there in what took place that are setting us up for the period that we're in. So we need, in a sense, to connect a number of these things. Yes.
C.C. Jarvis, are there any tales or myths of the elementals being wildlife guardians, custodians of fin, fowl, and hoof?
There are all kinds of animal spirit stories, and I think
there are like buffalo.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Oh my God. The Native American stories around that. And again, how good is the perception of the culture? Think of how, the Laplanders, that whole story of the reindeer and the flying reindeer, that we get Santa Claus and all that from them. They are tuned into a totally different level of reality. So there are realms there that everyday humanity has forgotten. And we sort of are looking through a glass darkly on a number of different things. And when we try to get our hands around the UFO file piece, when you go from researcher to researcher, people start to understand certain things. But you can see on the broad spectrum, when they've introduced all of these government entities and marketing stuff and all the rest of it, it takes the UFO reporting and the UFO research thing into something that has nothing to do with anything around gaining knowledge, So there's really two tracks there that we need to think about, which is one is this completely false version of this stuff, and then there's the real UFO file research, which I think can get us to that place. Yeah.
I'm just sitting here having a realization that, if we are expanding our consciousness. Everyone knows this. There's a quickening that's happening.
Oh, yeah.
And it seems the thing that is keeping us tethered to the earth, our consciousness, is fear. And mostly and keeping us in our root chakra, we're, terrified about money and housing and all this kind of, and that's the trick. It seems like they figured out that if they keep us in survival mode, it disconnects us from spirits, right?
Yes.
From our spiritual connection
Absolutely.
to the land, to the fae, to the heavens, all of it.
Oh, there's no question. It's Graham Hancock's channel normal. If you step outside of channel normal, you're in for it. And of course, when Graham stepped outside of channel normal, they sicked the Psychop group on him, which were basically a bunch of CIA people, like Amazing Randy and stuff. You know, Michael Shermer. You know, these are some of the worst types, and you know, but they made real trouble for a lot of researchers. They would go to the universities that we're going to speak at and say, like, hey, we're going to give you problems if you let them speak. I mean, it was a real effort to keep humanity from exploring. Remember that the real problem here, some people say, well, the alien thing is the biggest story humanity could confront. It's actually not true. It's humanity's own past in Atlantis. And, you know, the concept there of, I mean, reincarnation, yes, but ultimately resurrection, right? That's the biggest story. Then, you know, the idea that there would be peers in that universe, other beings, you'd raise your awareness level. It's almost like a rising tide lifts all boats. The minute you get starting to raise that consciousness, that awareness level, all these other things come in, you know. The intuition starts to lead you in the right way. I would also say this, that it's not, you know, you can't get real full disclosure from the government on this. And that's not really even a goal. I think what you can get is you can get some of what their programs were about, which could be indicative of the types of interactions that the government has had with the advanced technology that they've discovered. So I think it is worthwhile to pursue, but I think the actual disclosure around things of an off-world character would be available through the interaction of people researching it and those who've experienced the things. That to me would get you to deeper answers. You're not going to get to deeper answers with the government. That's the weird thing about all this. Yes, what do you got?
Johnny Ringo 215 says, maybe Elon says there's no UFOs because to him they aren't unidentified. And Linda, that's a good point. Semantics, right? Linda Pinty says, DJ, why would Peter Thiel bankroll these obstructionist guys? Didn't Thiel bankroll J.D. Vance? And Don Neway says Sauron is known for modifying some species in Tolkien's works for war.
Oh, yeah. Well, here's something. First of all, on Peter Thiel. So it's a fact. It's not just some thing. It's part of the guy's bio that the Jesse Michaels guy is an investor for many years for Thiel. So he's a hedge fund guy who's an investor for Thiel. Yeah, he's a pet of Thiel's. Now, Thiel, you know, he's not like a George Soros level of demagogue, but he, through Palantir and other things, has done a lot of shady things, let's face it. So when you're linked in with that, you're part of a technocratic, the whole centralization idea, and, you know, ultimately leads to the digital concentration camp. So if you have people like that, and you drop them in the middle of the UFO field to spin things in different ways, and then they start adopting things from, you know, this show and putting them in the mouths of the CIA people like Elizondo, that's very sketchy stuff. So the idea with Thiel, with Vance, I think when you get at that political level and you're dealing with tech the way that Vance was, anybody in that spectrum is going to be dealing with Thiel because of the amount of money and influence that he has. So I don't hold that against Thiel. The only thing that I'm saying is there's a manipulation in this space. Like it's not an organic space. So it's constantly manipulated by counterintelligence people when you get around the UFO file. Our work here on this program at times has sent shockwaves into that system because we've raised things that have been picked up on a very high level. And so this is the nature of the problem. They need to spin things, and they had problems creating a narrative. And I think at a certain point, what they decided to do was data mine programs like ours on purpose, and then make the CIA people sound like they had a coherent narrative instead of their weird threat thing or the drama or whatever. So the fact that they now have this guy who, platforms all of the CIA disinformation people and then parrots the X series, then that's a problem because, first of all, I've already exposed the fact that they're doing that. So in terms of counterintelligence, it becomes much harder to pull off because if people, there's enough people in the ideas room who will see something and be like, well, wait a minute, that comes from the X series. You can't put that in Lou Elizondo's, book or whatever. So, this is the kind of back and forth thing, but their goal and their money, gives them a tremendous amount of influence. But I'll tell you, you can get a lot more done. In a way, it shows the level of the counterintelligence operations because they don't have organic support. What they do is they create these environments and they create narratives, and then they get these different podcasts and things to go along with them so that they get News Nation and stuff like that, who doesn't know anything about the UFO file, and, you get guys who are well-meaning like Tucker Carlson or whatever, and he's like, I know about UFOs. I have Lou Elizondo on speed dial. Well, the only thing that tells me is that the CIA has a spin for you about what UFOs are that they want you to say. So, you have to be careful when you get into it. I find that, and I've called out different people doing this before, like Candace Owens, for example, who loves to embrace the Tate brothers. And, Ron DeSantis came out, the governor of Florida, and said, Romania let these guys out of jail, and they are pimps and predators. I mean, there's no question about it. And DeSantis said, look, why bother landing in Florida? We don't want you here, and it's a good point. And he was right. And so Candace Owens, who's supposed to be an independent media person and all this stuff, her husband, English elite guy, is friends with Tate. So that's not independent journalism. That is bought and paid for stuff and weird. And as is the disinformation that they put out about a number of different subjects. So it's not just her, and I'm sure that those people are smart enough to do good work, but this is what happens on the ground when you look at the independent media world. There's a lot of problems with it. And as somebody who's been a critic of mainstream media, having been exposed pretty closely to it, I can tell you the independent media is, what did Steiner say? Theosophy had become an arena for all kinds of occult shenanigans by 1910. Well, the independent media is becoming an arena for all kinds of disinformation. So you have to be careful with it and build something real. And, you have to stand for something, even if you are a lone outpost doing it. You can't have people who are counterintelligence agents in charge of anything around the UFO file. If you want to see how it's important to humanity and humanity's development and humanity's origin story and things like that, you never want those people around anything because they are the best trained liars on the planet and they're doing their job. That's their job. So, you just, in the public, you have to wise up. And so one of the things we try to do here is give you that information. And it's not to pick out any particular personality. As a matter of fact, I don't even like to comment on other researchers because everyone does the research that they're going to do, and that's the way it goes. But when the CIA people reach into this show and imitate things, and when I see them manipulating things in the public for a UFO threat and the psionic thing now, then you have to do everything you can to call it out. And it works. It catches on. Just like I mentioned that the thing with Rogan where he's like, he's starting to realize that he's being snowed by all those people. And that's good. So, the word gets through one way or another, and that can be directly just the interaction of you and I here in the Ideas Room. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Whew, it's X series X-190, Psychic Elementals, and the UFO file, going deep, deep here. By the way, that also includes the JFK, files and them trying to attribute it to a state actor. The JFK assassination goes directly to two things: the CIA assassination group and the X-Protect aerospace wing of that. So that's where you're going to find answers on that. And going to a state sponsor, Russia did it, Israel did it, you might as well just say North Korea did it. That doesn't work because you have a system, an organized system that has nothing to do with the state involved in the Kennedy assassination. That's why the records were held for 61 years. And who's the person that's holding them back? It's the Central Intelligence Agency. Well, that lets you know that the deep state is still very much in control. And, I want to say this in relation to people who were beating up on the Attorney General and all that, and the new FBI director. Look, they have what I call a Stansfield Turner problem. And I'll just say this briefly, but Stansfield Turner was the person that, Jimmy Carter, when he got in, George Bush was in charge of the Central Intelligence Agency, and he really controlled everything. So Carter didn't fire him because it would have been like firing J. Edgar Hoover or somebody. But then Carter went to him and said, I want everything you have on the UFO file because I made campaign promises around this. And Bush said to him, you don't have a need to know. I'm not giving you anything. And Carter fired Bush. I don't know why that story isn't told more, because it's a very interesting and factually based story. But what Carter did was he took a friend of his who was an admiral that ran a military school named Stansfield Turner, and he installed him at the top of the Central Intelligence Agency. After 4 years of him at the top, he went back to Carter and said, I can't get into anything. They've sectioned everything off in such a way, they've compartmentalized in such a way that they're not even respecting me as director. You see, those are the types of things you run into. So it's not like Trump gets in there and appoints this great team, which he has, a fantastic team, and that they can do everything, because you have decades and decades and decades of CIA, Homeland Security, NGA, NRO corruption, FBI corruption. And so you're going to make efforts, if you're Trump, to say, hey, there's a new sheriff in town or whatever. But it's a process, that whole thing. It's it's the same problem that Stansfield Turner had. And interestingly enough, during the Carter years, as we found out, even though they got rid of a lot of CIA people, those people just went offshore and formed something called the Safari Club. And the Safari Club still engaged in drug running, gun running, and all the rest by interfacing with the heads of other intelligence agencies like Iranian, French, and others. And they just waited till Reagan got in. And when Reagan got in, then the CIA had another heyday because of all the work to do on the counterintelligence and black ops side in Central America. So that thing maintains regardless of who you have in office. I mean, when Kennedy was the president, he had the same struggles. His own CIA wouldn't take orders from him. So, this is the nature of the problem that Trump is going to have, but at least, it's identified. I mean, he knows, and he's installed the people to at least go after it. But the guarantee of success is not there. And, the deep state operates, it has a number of contingency plans for when the person who gets in is not somebody that they favor. Yes, Miss Olivia.
I'm gonna throw it open here. Golden Warrior says, why do they not want us to know? This is kind of the meta question. It's really because there's a system in place, and these people are at the top of the pyramid, and they want to protect their position. They're ultimately, when we live in fear, when our reality is controlled, they can be assured of their position at the top of the pyramid.
Yeah, well, everything, if you look, you can go from, in modern history, say the Civil War, And we can look at British involvement in trying to fund both sides so America could be split up. There's been a goal to dismantle America since the revolution, really. And a lot of that has come out of the UK, but it's more of a worldwide association of these different groups. And but the goal of splitting up America is still very much part of what they want to do. And the fact that they have an America first or America centric leadership model right now is something that for them just means they need to step back, figure out how to infiltrate that and use it to their own purposes. So you can see the billionaire tech groups moving in to position to try to, game the Trump administration. And so we're going to see how that all plays out. But there's no question that maintaining this kind of emergency environment, creating emergency powers, taking from a pool of unconstitutional powers is what they've been good at. And so when they've run these different ops and sent incredible amounts of money and power to the top, including the COVID op, the financial coup d'etat of 2008, 9/11, all of these different things, Enron, you can continue to consolidate and consolidate and consolidate, but at a certain point you become top heavy and some of your control starts to slip. And so what they've tried to do is accumulate without slipping. And so they'll use a number of different tactics. And certainly the war against Russia was part of the tactic and drawing everyone into that. You notice how much resistance there is to ending that war from the World Economic Forum types, or even the leader of the Ukraine who embarrassed himself today at the White House. What is it about Ukraine and the war against Russia that is so important to them? It goes very deep. It goes into the UFO file because those leaders, Trump and Putin getting together in relation to the UFO file, is the same thing they've tried to stop, whether it was Kennedy and Khrushchev, Gorbachev and Reagan and others. Because if those leaders get together and start talking and dishing out the UFO file on their own, watch out. What do you got?
I'm going to give this to Bethany G. She says, let's dream that dream of love, peace, safety, and happiness for all beings, and may all beings realize their own personal sovereignty and light.
Oh,
Just
absolutely.
need a moment of goodness in there. Okay, so Fred Olson says, I'd like to hear DJ comment on how major UFO talking heads like Avi Loeb, Semivan, and Danny Sheehan all talk about us needing a new religion with UFO gods.
Yeah, that's really true. Well, Avi Loeb is on a particular mission. His mission, he's right over here. His lab is right next to me. And Elizondo went over there and dedicated some telescope with him like a year and a half ago. That was quite a moment. I'll tell you, the thing is, a guy like Loeb comes out of Israeli intelligence. So that's his background. So he's the Israeli version of Central Intelligence person here. So as soon as he set up this group, Galileo, at first it looked like it was going to be scientists and people like that. And then all of a sudden, Elizondo, Mellon, all the CIA people were on the board, Semivan and all that. So, that's where he's arrived at. That's where he's coming from. So he's part of this group, and it's supposed to be that he's tracking the idea that alien ships have come in from other galaxies in our AI, and that our AI can communicate with them, and that we can get messages from them. So that's one type of op that's going on there. So Loeb represents a deep one, and I don't hold it against him so much. It's just that's the program he's going to work, just like Elizondo is going to work. They're counterintelligence people. And I think, Loeb deep into the scientific community here, and they're trying to figure out with that whole story about the UFO file and the breakaway technology, how to break back in with it. And they need to break in with a story because they've been working on this in the background for 8 decades now. And if they're going to come in to revealing the technology on any level, then we're going to have to know what was going on. So they've been working on different narratives to pull out there. Oh, there's an alien threat. Oh, we have psychic interfaces. Whatever it happens to be, whatever they settle on, they need it to stick. And they also need, and it's an episode I'm working on about a sky emergency. They need to know how valid the public response to the sky emergency would be. That's where you got all of the drone swarms that were taking place in December, which were real, which did happen. And, the problem was that the alternative media dropped the ball on that. And they went along with the mainstream narrative that people were misunderstood what a plane looked like all of a sudden. Gee, isn't that interesting? How about the fact that they were flying over Bedminster, which was, the president-elect's residence in New Jersey, and also the fact that Trump, when he was driving around, now needed anti-drone guns on the top of his limo. These are things that took place in a real environment, and the continuity of government people, the Northcom commander, who's the COG combatant commander, was running Operation Homeland Synchronizer. These are things that were taking place on the ground during that drone swarm. They got all this feedback from that, and now they can look at it and say, well, will people go for this UFO threat if it comes from the sky? Like, will the sky emergency work? And I think that's what they're trying to figure out right now. One thing I wanted to mention, going back to the elementals, because let me tell you, I can talk about COG all night. That's the danger there. Couple of quick quotes to fit in on Steiner on this, and then we'll take your last couple of questions. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, X-190, X-Series, Psychic Elementals, and the UFO File. I do want to say, for the person who mentioned Elon Musk earlier, that he had the audacity on that same program to say that Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and the other defense contractors weren't in possession of any advanced technology, and he would know about it because he had clearances and they would show it to him. First of all, he can't talk about anything because he's a puppet of DARPA and all the rest of it.
What about Ben Rich?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So, even a guy like Rogan must have been looking at this guy in complete disbelief. But so with Elon, no, there's no advanced propulsion systems. No, there's no anti-gravity. And no, there's no UFOs. Well, that's all lies that he has to say in his position. So just keep that in mind when he's saying that. It's completely untrue. And unfortunately, I've seen with a few people, and not that many, but some influencer, like Brett Weinstein, I've pointed out before, and I'm sure he's a nice guy and everything, but he was saying, wow, wait till Doge gets around the black budget, man, all the UFO stuff will come out. No, Musk, he can't do anything like that. Don't you realize who you're talking about and who puts him in the position he's in? He can't operate in space without the Space Force and the United States Air Force. They give him permission to do it. If he blew any of their secrets, they would get rid of him and stick Bob Bigelow up there, or Jeff Bezos. And it's funny because Bezos with the Washington Post, he came out this week with this incredible statement saying the Washington Post is going to report only on 2 pillars now: free markets and personal freedom. So the Washington Post is now a conservative, free market publication. This is extraordinary, some of the moves that we're seeing. But these people flip sides and change masks all the time. And Musk, I don't think, is any better at all. As a matter of fact, what I do think is that he got on the Trump train at the right time. And I'm glad that he supported Trump because, we needed that in order for Trump to get into office. So, but on the other stuff, Boeing, I mean, come on, who does he think is listening to that? It's ridiculous. Of course, Boeing is in possession of breakaway technology. There's no question about it. Anyone who's studied it knows that. And I don't have any of that access to Musk satellites and all the rest of it. So, we just have to realize that is a little sideshow. And he's under orders to do that. So, it's nothing personal, but come on, let's get real. Okay, let's go back to Steiner. Someone who had ethical thoughts in the work he was doing. Gee, isn't that refreshing? My God. Quote, today's enlightened people may laugh when reminded that older folks used to see gnomes in everything earthy. However, when knowledge is no longer obtained by means of combining abstract logical thoughts, but by uniting ourselves through our thinking with the world rhythm, then we shall rediscover the elemental beings contained in everything of a solid, earthy nature. The outstanding characteristic of these elemental beings begins dwelling in solid earth. Their characteristic is cleverness, cunning, slyness, in fact, a one-sidedly developed intellect. We hear this about elementals a lot, which is there's something clever about them. Now, here's the thing that I think may relate to the UFO file, and we'll end the narrative on this note and take your last questions. But here's Steiner's quote. Think about this. In 1900, a relatively new kingdom of nature beings came into being. And then he says, at the turn of the century, a relatively new kingdom of nature beings will come into being, arising from nature like a spiritual spring. Now, obviously, he's talking about the year 2000 there, because the lecture is, I think, from 1914. So at the turn of the century, a relatively new kingdom of nature beings will come into being, arising from nature like a spiritual spring, and human beings will be able to see and experience this. And though it would show great apathy of soul if a person were unable to perceive the sprouting forth, there is more to come. These people who will grow able to experience as a fact nature that has been described will preserve these impressions in quite a different way through ordinary memory than through ordinary memory. They will carry beyond the threshold the new elemental spirits that stream toward them. As the seeds carry life through the winter into spring, what was experienced in spring and what was experienced in autumn, the bursting forth of nature in the spring and this melancholy in autumn had no connection one with another in the past. What the cosmos gives out from its memory enables us to carry over something of what we have experienced in the autumn into spring. If we let the elemental forces of autumn work in us, then we can feel in a new way what will be given us in the future. Everything will acquire something new in the future, and it is our duty to prepare ourselves through our knowledge of the spiritual to understand it. I think there's a lot in there. And talking about new elementals is fascinating. And with that, Miss Olivia, your
Rapboy Genius,
final
does
round.
Steiner ever talk about elementals abducting people? Bella Clark says, are orbs elementals? And Amanda says, could you ask DJ if he thinks it's dangerous for people without any training to engage in summoning UFOs?
I think that, it's interesting and could be experimented with to summon UFOs. They have the whole Stephen Greer thing, CE5 and all that, but I haven't heard very many compelling stories about that. I have seen that when people seem to kind of build up to an experience and then they have it, other people are completely blindsided and surprised by it. I remember a very interesting Cayce-like channel guy that I spent some time with investigating this October 13th, 2010 UFO sighting. And he had said to me, there are these Pleiadian beings that have made an agreement with you to photograph their craft. And I remember thinking it was a very interesting thing that he told me, because I'd had a series of dreams about what looked like skyscrapers sideways flying around. And there were there was this whole kind of wave of things that were going on. So, I don't think that there's anything dangerous in that. I just think the question is, what would you do it for? What's the goal and the purpose of doing it? But, if you're ready to do it and it was an experiment, I think it would be an interesting thing to do. In terms of elementals attacking people, things like that, I think what's funny is the most interesting stories about elementals come from the mining profession. And I think that there is, this whole thing about crypto-terrestrials, which we can follow up, which is a book by Mac Tawney's, which fits in to some of this. And Mac Tawney's idea, and he was somebody who worked very deeply around this and died very young. But he thought the crypto-terrestrials were exactly like humanity, but a little more advanced, not that much. And that they kept themselves hidden by being parallel, side by side with humanity, but they were actually underground dwellers. So certainly they like to say we live in a universe teeming with life. Well, we live in a world teeming with different levels of life. And, it all happens right here. And then that connection to the larger cosmos becomes that whole piece about, you're in the center and then you're connected. So it's the microcosm, macrocosm aspect. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Robert M. Stahl, was Steiner optimistic?
Excellent question. Well, look, I pointed this out before that if you look through the theosophical work, you'll see they are incredibly optimistic about everything. They're like, the next root race is coming in. It's a new epoch. And they'll all be psychic. They'll telepathically communicate with each other. Everything's going to be great. War will be thought of as stupid and all this stuff. Really like upbeat stuff. And then Steiner comes in and says, well, it's true. And yet the problem is there's a huge clash with this Ahrimanic technology in the 21st century. In fact, it leads in this 21st century to an incarnation of actual Ahriman, a physical incarnation. And I don't know, how would he come in as this incredible cyborg supercomputer? It's hard to say, but I think that Steiner put it where it was, as he was saying, right now is that the chance to apprehend this. And he didn't say to shy away from technology and things of that nature, but to be aware and to maintain that balance in life between the spiritual aspect and this heavy-duty scientific materialism coming in through the technology. So, but, that's a theme in the Gurdjieff work, too, about machines versus humans and humans as machines. And so the mystery schools have been laying that out through a number of different channels. But I think, again, just like the Cayce work, Cayce saw incredible things coming for their future, but he also saw intense earth changes and problems, and so, but he would throw it out there and say, what will humanity do? And I think this is the question, because it is all about free will. And, on one hand, we could go into this incredible golden age, and on the other, we've brought ourselves to the brink of nuclear war. The weapons we have now, the rods of God weapons, of course, as soon as I put that episode out, it was, they pulled it. So, I think there's a lot of things to answer there, but certainly there's a lot to be optimistic about. And I think the more we get into the mystery school aspect and that information, the more we have a foundation. And I think the question becomes, have we used the information that they've given us? One of the things that Gurdjieff passed along to J.G. Bennett was that mystery schools didn't really work and organize in large it wasn't like you're supposed to keep this corporation going, that they sort of came above board to the public, spread their seeds, and then go back into their places. And so the question is, what happens with that seed that they've put out there? How have we done with it? And I think the UFO aspect is a piece of that. And I think that the rising of Atlantis in our consciousness is another major piece for humanity into the future, including our own abilities and our own place in all of this. So that would be my closing thought with this. And with that, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Before you close out, everybody wants to know about the Rods of God episode.
I'm going to, I thought about different ways to do it where they wouldn't pull it, but I will do a complete Rods of God episode with the special information that I have about it. And we'll put that out probably in March. So it's coming up for sure. There's fantastic things, including a major update on the Brother Sunburst case and the Melchizedek device. All of that's coming up in March. So you know where to find it right here. And with that, Miss Olivia, we are done for tonight.
I'm going to let Scarlet Fire have the last word. The positive energy of humans is sweeping the globe. I'm optimistic that the future we are creating will be one of love, peace, and harmony within all. The dark is being overwhelmed with light.
Oh, wow. Isn't that fascinating? What about this? Yeah, no, I would agree.
Can I make a comment on that? Because I get sometimes the new agey woo-woo world gets me down because I feel like they're a little naive.
Sure.
And
George Ellery
but
Hale.
I do think that human beings have had so much of everything that I think what it is we need to get bored with conflict. We need to have so much of it with war and conflict and, that you're like, bored with everything, bored with the matrix, bored with every possibility to the point where like, okay, we're really open because this is to the next world, really. Yes. And the trick is, I think there are people who are bored with conflict and war who want a one world government, right? So that's their solution.
Excellent point. Yeah.
Version. And, I can see they're coming from a place of, wanting peace, a lot of them.
Well, think about someone like Jacinda Ardern, for example. The WEF people, they profile those who can be psychopathic enough to be cold-blooded. Mm-hmm. So they have the intelligence, they have the personality or whatever, but they need this other factor in order to rise in that system. That's where you get Chrystia Freeland and all the rest. By the way, this image I thought was particularly good. About
gorgeous
some of those, and there's so much mythology and folklore there to plug into that I think goes far beyond superstition and imagination. And what do you got there, Super Chatters?
Okay, hang on one second. Let me line them up. Okay, a cult fan, Stefan Vanderlaan, Jake, Brian Whitaker, Ray Story, Eurythmia's Fun, Wolfgang McCarthy, Thomas Ball, Debbie McAdoo, The Bikini Truther, Michael Cox, Alarminine Bay, Kathleen, Black Tie, Descat Rock, Kevin Bauman, Jay Parsons, Jimmy Lyle Kennemer, Barry 7676, Norman Lee Smith Music, C.A. Beverforden, Robert Scott, D. Bones Swish, John Matthews, Erica Swenson Elliott. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
That's fantastic. And I guess if Jimmy is out there, he must be feeling better. Mm-hmm. So that's great news. As a prelude to an upcoming episode, which is going to be a mind blower about a particular strain of lapis in Arizona, I'm going to read you a Cayce teaser, and then we'll do a couple of shout outs at the end. But listen how this plays in, if you think about it, to our elemental episode. Watch this. There is confusion respecting lapis and lapis linguis. It has been given that lapis linguis is the name which was implied to touchstones or those used by initiates in their various ceremonial activities, and hence gain for themselves through those forces as indicated that they adhere to the activities of the bodies or associations in such a way and manner. The stones here, see? That those of a psychic turn may hear the emanations as retained or thrown off by influences about such stones. They call them singing stones. They are the semi-gem or the semi-value to those for other than decorative or for those who have not yet comprehended or there has not been admitted by certain fields of activity the value of such stones in relationship to such conditions for those that are not gifted or those that are not so sensitive as to be able to hear the vibrations giving off. Yet, as has been indicated for this body, there is the ability within the body to hear the singing or the movements much in the same way and manner as was given or is given to any, if they will listen for days, to a growing tree, or as was accredited to and is heard by many of those who have developed in certain portions of this world as to be able to gain much from especially a growing oak tree, or certain other trees peculiar to those vicinities. So in the stone lapis, Lapis Linguis, is that one that has been in use or in touch with those whose vibrations or emanations or auras are such a nature as to have been given those vibrations in the nature that any portion of such a stone may give off that which may be heard by the entity. Do you see? So this stone, which grows in abundance in this very unusual mine in Arizona, and there's a whole strange story about this whirlwind pulling Cayce there to Arizona to witness that mine. But what comes out of it is that particular aspect of lapis was what the Atlanteans would go to Arizona to mine for. So that's going to become very important when we do this upcoming episode on Arizona. So keep that in mind as we go. And with that, I'm going to do a couple of shout outs and we're done. Mm-hmm. Anything else you have there?
Is lapis protective? I know it's supposed to open up your perception, right?
It certainly triggers the third eye. And but spiritual protection, I would think so naturally. Absolutely. And the fact that the Atlanteans and, what's fascinating is at a certain point, many of those masks, like the King Tut death mask and all the rest, they have lapis as the mascara around the eyes. So I think there's a great deal with lapis that we still don't understand. It's an ore of copper, as we know. But again, when he refers to it, he's talking about a particular type, and he identifies it. And I think azurite is the correct way to term it. And it's so great to have everyone out there tonight. Deep, deep esoteric subject, perfect for the ideas room tonight. But boy, I think you can feel the overlap of some of that. And let's see what we got there. Sharon Woodward, Mara, a wild encounter with 60 Matara. Matara, give me that one.
I don't know.
I'm not familiar with Matara. I would love to know what that is. So let's find out what it is. Okay. Larynx lazuli. Isn't that interesting? Huh. Well, I like that. I had a lupus slave bracelet and it was beautiful. Lapis, I'm sure. Thomas Ball says, no. Let's see. Corey Anderson, it's great to have you out there. Kevin Marble. Lapis is one of the 12 items on the priest's breastplate. It has a bee come a feature in my catacombs. Huh. Interesting. Arizona strikes a personal note, says Poppy Capu. Occult Elvis, somebody else says. What does it mean? I don't know. Oh, interesting about the lapis for the eyes. Bikini Truther. Indeed. Indeed. Scarlet Fire, it's good to see you out there. Sammy. DJ, get RFK soon. Yeah, well, he's a busy guy right now. I can tell you that. Let's see. I have a lapis ring. Feels empowering and very mystical, even magical when I wear it. Someone told me if I wore amethyst, I'd have a split personality. You're going to have to explain that one to me. Good at stones, too. Lapis is blue, says Najat. Excellent point. There we go with blue. Thank you, DJ. What a great show. Bella Clark. Thank you, Bella. Great to have so many of you out there. Jen Passivant. I don't believe it's protective, but black tourmaline, black kyanite, and labradorite are interesting. Huh. Lapis lazuli, says Holly. Indeed. Yep. The lapis is coming in. Just wait till that episode. We're going to have fun. Let's see. Wild night tonight. Thank you, DJ and Olivia. That's Najat. Fantastic. Sammy says, please. Indeed. Wow, what a show. Gypsy Moon. It's great to have you out there. DJ, what about the Law of One raw material? Yeah, well, the Cayce information about the Law of One and the Amelius group is just completely separate from that. So when you go to evaluate that or read it, whatever you get out of it, they're different things. And so when I speak about the Rata Cayce work, that is completely different. That's the only thing I think to keep in mind there. One of the stones from Lucifer's chest plate of gemstones. I remember Farrell talking to me about Lucifer's crown. I'll have to go back to that story. Very interesting story indeed. Thank you for talking about spiritual preparation for advanced knowledge. Indeed. Do a show with Gigi Young. Of course, we're going to have her back. She's been busy, and she's been doing incredible things, of course, on her channel. Amazing stuff. Let's see. Sharon,
I have a question from Conrad.
I think I hold on. Remember this? Manta rays. I sang in the deep key of D in my story. Excellent. Okay, yes, what do you got?
Conrad says, hey, DJ, you left us hanging on LBJ's gold. When will you wrap back to that?
Yeah, I have a very strange thing about his activities there. So I guess when I have it, it won't be long. Maybe it'll be within the next 2 months. Let's put it that way. DJ, you left us hanging. That's the one. And it is Conrad. Don't worry, Conrad. We'll be back at you with the gold episode and LBJ for sure. Okay, black tourmaline. Someone else. People are real fans of that tourmaline.
I'm not.
Interesting.
I got some for protection. It just brought me down.
Isn't that interesting?
So, wow. No matter what they say,
okay,
you have to trust your own energy field.
Yes.
The feedback you're getting.
I'll tell you what's interesting. Here's a little secret. Also, when Cayce was talking about the lapis, he said, "Oh, make sure it's not polished," and he preferred the raw stone encased in like a glass or whatever. He didn't want it to be polished down. Apparently, that takes some of the potency down. Isn't that interesting? You're going to have to tell me about how that works. All right, Bethany G. Yes, thank you, DJ and Olivia, and all in the Ideas Room. So great to be together and enjoy unfolding the mystery together. Absolutely. Whew. Jonathan Smedley. Let's see. Actually, last misquote. Carla has some ill repute. Oh, missed that. Okay. Predicting the future and such. Exactly. Ray Story, Shane Walker, more Pawgate. Yeah, I have something special about the Hall of Records, so it'll crisscross with Pawgate nicely. It's all coming up. There's going to be a lot of, there's a real wave of mystery school work coming your way. So in anticipation of the JFK records coming out, I'm just going to keep building on the mystery school side. Okay, if you forgot to like, then like. Yes, like the video, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to the newsletter, support the show, become a subscriber. There's so many great things coming up for subscribers to Dark Journalist. That I can tell you. Interesting, read the rough stones. It is. I remember thinking you have to make that extra effort. Thank you, DJ Ideas from an Olivia. Thank you, Heather Sansone. Robert Scott, Jen Passavant. Okay, Thomas Ball, Don Neway. There he is. That's what I was looking for. Thanks, Elementals, for being so polite in the Ideas Room. Unbelievable. He gets the quote of the night there. We will see you all next week, and there's a lot going on, so we may have a special report coming up if things bubble to the surface. And we have a very exciting Lapis, Arizona episode coming up for you. There's 3 or 4 very exciting episodes coming up in quick succession here. So make sure you stay tuned with us, and we will be making sure that you guys have a great weekend. And thank you for being here with us. And after all, it says end broadcast, but
never really ends.
It never really ends. And never let it be forgot. Once there was a Camelot. I'm sure there were elementals in Camelot.
Absolutely.
There's no question about it. The whole Arthurian stream and such, and Uther and Merlin. My goodness. They could conjure them. What's that root? Everyone have a great night, and we'll see you next week.
God bless everybody.